Amid the echoes of collapsing empires and the slow turning of centuries, there rose a city that refused to die. While Rome burned, fractured, and faded into memory, its eastern soul endured, reshaped in marble, law, faith, and fire. This was Byzantium, a civilization standing at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, where emperors ruled as God's regents on earth, and history itself seemed to bend beneath golden domes. From the shores of the Bosporus, Constantinople watched the ancient world dissolve and the medieval world emerge. It faced relentless sieges, internal betrayals, theological wars, and the pressure of rising powers that sought to erase it from time. Yet again and again, the empire adapted, sometimes through brilliance, sometimes through ruthless necessity. This is not merely the story of an empire that survived 1,000 years after Rome's fall. It is the story of continuity in a world of collapse, of Roman law preserved when the West forgot it, of Greek thought safeguarded while Europe descended into fragmentation, of faith transformed into imperial identity, and power sanctified by belief. The Byzantine Empire was not frozen in time. It evolved, fractured, reformed, and endured. Its legacy shaped Eastern Europe, the Orthodox world, Islamic scholarship, and the rebirth of Western civilization itself. To understand Byzantium is to understand how civilizations persist against the weight of history and what it costs to do so. Chapter 1. Rome Reborn East. In the twilight of the ancient world, as the sun set on Rome's western horizons, the empire faced a truth it could no longer deny. The old center could not hold. The city of Rome, once the axis of the known world, had become a symbol weighed down by its own history. Its frontiers were too distant, its defenses overstretched, its politics poisoned by instability and ambition. Across the Rhine and Danube, pressure mounted. Along the imperial court, power shifted hands with alarming speed, and beneath the surface, the machinery of empire strained under a century of crisis. Yet Rome did not collapse all at once. Instead, it adapted. Long before the final fall of the Western Empire, Roman emperors had begun to look eastward, not out of nostalgia, but necessity. The eastern provinces were richer, more urbanized, and more stable. Egypt fed the empire's grain supply. Syria anchored trade routes stretching into Persia and beyond. Asia Minor provided manpower, industry, and defensible terrain. While the West fractured under repeated invasions and internal decay, the East endured, organized, wealthy, and resilient. In the dawn of the 4th century, one decision would quietly alter the course of history. At the narrow straits where Europe meets Asia, there stood an ancient Greek city named Byzantium. It was not large, it was not famous, but it occupied a position of almost supernatural strategic value. Guarded by water on 3 sides, commanding the Bosporus, the only sea passage between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean, it controlled trade, movement, and military access between continents. Whoever held this city held the hinge of the ancient world. When the Roman emperor chose Byzantium as the site of a new imperial capital, it wasn't an act of abandonment, but of preservation. Stone by stone, law by law, ritual by ritual, the empire was transplanted. The old heart of Rome was not erased, it was reborn. Temples, forums, palaces, and walls rose with deliberate symbolism. This new capital was designed not as a break from Roman identity, but as its continuation. Rome renewed, Rome fortified, Rome eternal. The city was renamed Constantinople, and with that name came an idea that the empire could survive by shifting its center of gravity without surrendering its soul. Beneath the shadow of empires past, Constantinople emerged as something unprecedented. It was Roman in law, Greek in language, and increasingly Christian in spirit. Senators walked marble streets beside bishops. Latin legal traditions coexisted with Hellenic education. Imperial authority now rested not only on military power, but on divine sanction. This fusion was not accidental. It was evolutionary. The transfer of power eastward marked the beginning of a transformation so gradual that its participants scarcely noticed it unfolding. To the people of the empire, this was not the birth of a new civilization. It was Rome, simply better positioned to endure the storms ahead. Yet this choice carried profound consequences. By concentrating imperial resources in the east, the balance of the Roman world shifted irreversibly. Armies followed the emperor. Wealth flowed toward the Bosporus. Administrative attention moved away from the struggling western provinces. The west would be left to fend for itself, still Roman in name, but increasingly unsupported in reality. In Constantinople, imperial ceremony became more elaborate, more sacred, more distant from the populace. The emperor was no longer merely first among citizens, but God's chosen guardian of order on earth. The palace became a stage of ritual power. Authority was choreographed, not debated. Stability replaced republican memory. This was Rome adapting to a new age, less flexible, more centralized, and more symbolic. And it worked. While cities like Milan, Trier, and eventually Rome itself faced decline, Constantinople flourished. Its walls grew thicker, its harbors busier, its population swelled with merchants, soldiers, scholars, and officials drawn by opportunity and security. From its vantage point, the empire could watch the old world fracture while remaining intact. But survival demanded sacrifice. The empire's identity began to change, even as it denied the change was happening. Latin slowly receded from daily use. Greek thought shaped education and theology. Christianity reshaped imperial purpose. The emperor ruled a Roman state, but no longer one that resembled the republic or principate of old. This tension between continuity and transformation would define everything that followed. Rome had chosen to survive by becoming something new without admitting it had changed. Constantinople was not meant to replace Rome. It was meant to be Rome, perfected and preserved. Yet history is never static. Every act of preservation reshapes what it seeks to protect. Thus began an era that would stretch across a millennium. An empire born from crisis, sustained by adaptation, and forged in the belief that Rome could never truly fall, as long as it was willing to move. From the moment Constantinople was declared the new imperial capital, the city became more than a seat of power. It became a statement carved into stone. Every avenue, every column, every ceremonial space was designed to speak a single message across centuries. Rome still lived. The city's construction unfolded with deliberate urgency. Marble was hauled from across the empire. Statues from ancient cities were uprooted and installed in new forums, not as decoration, but as inheritance. The past was not discarded. It was physically embedded into the present. Constantine and his successors understood that legitimacy did not come from novelty, but from continuity. To rule the Roman Empire, one had to look Roman. Yet Constantinople was not a mirror of old Rome. It was something sharper, more controlled, more defensive. Massive walls rose along its landward side, fortifications unlike anything the ancient world had seen. Moats, towers, and layered defenses transformed the city into a fortress capital, prepared not just for rebellion, but for the long future of siege warfare. Where Rome relied on tradition and prestige, Constantinople relied on geometry, engineering, and foresight. Inside the walls, power reorganized itself. The imperial court evolved into a carefully managed system of hierarchy and ritual. Access to the emperor became restricted, choreographed, symbolic. The ruler was no longer a visible participant in civic life, but a distant figure elevated by ceremony. Gold-threaded robes, jeweled crowns, and ritual prostration redefined authority. The emperor was no longer simply commander-in-chief. He was the embodiment of imperial order itself. This transformation was not cosmetic. It reflected a deeper shift in how power survived in a changing world. The old Roman reliance on civic participation and senatorial debate had proven fragile. The new empire demanded discipline, loyalty, and centralized command. In an age of constant threat, ambiguity became weakness. At the same time, Christianity continued its steady ascent. Churches rose beside administrative buildings. Bishops gained influence not only as spiritual leaders, but as social stabilizers. The Christian faith provided a shared moral language across diverse populations: Greek, Latin, Syrian, Egyptian. It offered unity where ethnicity and local tradition could not. Imperial authority and Christian doctrine began to reinforce one another, each lending legitimacy to the other. Yet this union was still forming. Pagan traditions had not vanished. Temples remained. Old rituals persisted beneath the surface of daily life. Constantinople was not instantly Christian. It was gradually transformed, shaped by imperial favor and cultural momentum rather than sudden decree. Meanwhile, beyond the city's walls, the empire faced a divided reality. The East prospered. The West deteriorated. As imperial focus centered on Constantinople, the western provinces slipped further into crisis. Invasions intensified. Local administrations collapsed. Roman authority became fragmented, then symbolic, then irrelevant. One by one, Western territories fell under the control of new rulers who claimed Roman titles but ruled without Roman institutions. From Constantinople, these losses were not always seen as the end of Rome, but as temporary fractures. The empire still considered itself whole, even as half its body withered. Maps were slow to change. Titles were preserved long after the reality beneath them vanished. This denial was not ignorance, it was strategy. By maintaining the idea of unity, the empire preserved its claim to universal authority. The emperor in Constantinople did not rule half an empire. He ruled the Roman Empire, period. The fact that his power no longer reached Britain or Gaul did not negate the concept. It merely postponed its restoration. This mindset would shape Byzantine policy for centuries. The East did not see itself as a successor state. It was the state. Others were interlopers, rebels, or temporary custodians of Roman land. This belief fueled diplomacy, warfare, and imperial identity long after the West had forgotten what Rome once meant. Within Constantinople, daily life reflected this confidence. Markets bustled with goods from across continents. Grain ships arrived reliably from Egypt. Artisans produced silks, weapons, icons, and books. Scholars preserved classical learning, not as nostalgia, but as living tradition. Roman law continued to govern contracts, property, and citizenship, binding the present to the ancient past. The city became a living archive of civilization. But beneath the order and prosperity lay unresolved tension. The empire had survived by centralizing power, sanctifying authority and shifting eastward. These choices brought stability, but also rigidity. Adaptation had saved Rome once. Whether it could continue to adapt without breaking remained uncertain. Beyond the Danube, new peoples pressed against the borders. To the east, Persia watched carefully. Within the empire, theological disagreement simmered beneath the surface. Constantinople was strong, but strength invites challenge. The rebirth of Rome in the east had succeeded. The question now was not whether the empire could endure, but what it would become in the process. The foundations were set. The walls stood firm. The idea of Rome lived on, transformed, centralized, and vigilant. But history was gathering momentum, and the age of survival was about to be tested. By the middle of the 5th century, the transformation was no longer subtle. The Western Roman Empire had collapsed into memory, its emperors deposed, its institutions fractured, its cities repurposed under new rulers who spoke Roman titles but lived outside Roman tradition. In Constantinople, the reaction was not mourning, but recalibration. Rome had not fallen. The empire insisted. It had endured. Here, from the golden halls of the great palace, emperors ruled an empire that now stood alone as the final bearer of Roman legitimacy. The illusion of unity gave way to a hardened reality. Survival would no longer depend on reclaiming the past, but on mastering the present. The Eastern Roman state began to think in centuries, not campaigns. This shift reshaped everything. Governance became increasingly professionalized. Civil servants replaced aristocratic privilege. Tax systems grew more efficient, more unforgiving. The army was reorganized not for expansion, but for defense. Border troops hardened by constant vigilance. Field armies held in reserve to strike where pressure mounted. Constantinople itself became the keystone of the system, its security paramount above all else. Yet what truly distinguished this empire from its ancient predecessor was its worldview. Where old Rome had drawn legitimacy from conquest and civic tradition, the Eastern Empire drew authority from continuity and faith. The emperor was no longer merely the head of state. He was the guardian of cosmic order, responsible for the harmony between heaven and earth. This belief infused law, ceremony, and daily governance. Stability was no longer just political. It was sacred. Christianity, now inseparable from imperial identity, reshaped the empire's moral compass. Charity became institutionalized. Hospitals and poorhouses emerged. Bishops mediated disputes and stabilized cities when secular authority faltered. Faith offered resilience in a world that seemed to be unraveling beyond the empire's borders. At the same time, the cultural transformation reached a decisive point. Latin faded from administration, replaced by Greek, the language of philosophy, theology, and the Eastern Mediterranean. This was not a rejection of Rome, but an evolution of it. The empire retained Roman law, Roman titles, Roman identity, but expressed through a Hellenic voice. The people called themselves Romans. Their empire was Roman. History would later give it a different name, but that name did not yet exist. From the ashes of ruin, a civilization had not merely survived, it had been refined. Constantinople stood as a city unlike any other. Its skyline shimmered with domes and columns. Its streets echoed with multiple languages. Its harbors connected continents. It was simultaneously ancient and new, Roman and Greek, earthly and divine. Travelers described it with awe. Enemies viewed it with envy. To its citizens, it was the center of the world. But endurance bred new challenges. The empire's rigidity, born from necessity, limited flexibility. Centralized power reduced internal chaos, but magnified the consequences of poor leadership. Religious unity brought strength, but also intolerance for dissent. The belief in divine order made compromise difficult when theological disagreements arose. These tensions did not yet explode, but they gathered beneath the surface, waiting. Still, the achievement was undeniable. Against all historical odds, the Roman Empire had outlived itself. While the ancient world collapsed, its eastern half adapted, reorganized, and endured. It did so not by denying change, but by controlling it, by choosing what to preserve and what to abandon. This was the empire that would face Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and Crusaders. The empire that would preserve classical knowledge while the West rebuilt from ruins. The empire that would last nearly 1,000 years beyond the fall of Rome itself. Its rebirth in the East was not a moment. It was a process. One that redefined what empire meant in a post-classical world. And as the city's bells rang across the Bosporus, and the walls stood immovable against the tides of history, a new truth settled into the heart of the Roman state. Rome no longer needed the West to be Rome. It had become something leaner, harder, and more enduring, a civilization shaped by survival, sanctified by faith, and anchored in stone at the edge of 2 continents. Thus ended the beginning. Ahead lay centuries of challenge, of belief tested by controversy, of borders strained by new powers, of emperors rising and falling beneath the weight of sacred authority. And in the chapters to come, the empire would learn that survival, once achieved, must be defended again and again, sometimes not from enemies beyond the walls, but from conflicts within. Chapter 2. Faith and authority united. In the dawn of a new age, as the Eastern Roman Empire steadied itself behind stone walls and disciplined legions, a quieter revolution was taking place, one not forged in iron, but in belief. While borders were secured and administration refined, the soul of the empire was being reshaped. Faith, once a private conviction whispered in catacombs and hidden rooms, was moving inexorably toward the center of power. Christianity had survived persecution, martyrdom, and marginalization. Now, it stood before the throne. This transformation did not occur overnight, nor without resistance. The Roman world had long been a tapestry of gods, rituals, and philosophies. Temples still dotted cityscapes. Ancient festivals continued to mark the calendar. The old religious order had been deeply entwined with civic life, identity, and tradition. To alter it was to unsettle the foundations of society itself. Yet the empire was changing, and Christianity offered something the old gods no longer could: unity. In a realm spanning continents and cultures, belief became a tool of cohesion. The Christian faith spoke of universal truth, moral order, and a single divine authority, concepts that resonated powerfully with an empire struggling to maintain coherence. For emperors ruling from Constantinople, this was not merely theology, it was statecraft. Beneath the shadow of empires past, the emperor's role began to evolve. No longer was he simply the supreme magistrate or victorious general. He became God's chosen ruler on earth, entrusted with maintaining harmony between heaven and empire. Law was no longer only a human construct. It was an expression of divine will. Obedience to the emperor took on spiritual significance, and rebellion risked not only punishment, but damnation. This fusion of throne and altar marked a profound shift in Roman political culture. Imperial patronage reshaped the Christian world. Churches rose in city centers. Bishops gained legal authority. Christian morality influenced legislation, from family law to social welfare. The empire funded charitable institutions, hospitals, orphanages, poorhouses, embedding faith into the fabric of daily life. Christianity was no longer defined by martyrdom. It was defined by administration. Yet with recognition came responsibility and conflict. As Christianity moved from margins to mainstream, its internal divisions could no longer be ignored. What had once been theological debates among scholars and clerics now carried imperial consequences. Questions about the nature of Christ, the Trinity, and salvation were not abstract. They threatened unity itself. To manage this, emperors turned to councils. Gathered from across the empire, bishops debated doctrine under imperial oversight. These councils sought clarity, uniformity, and authority. Creeds were defined, heresies were named. Orthodoxy took shape not only through scripture, but through consensus enforced by power. For the empire, this was an act of preservation. A unified faith promised a unified people. Doctrine became a tool of stability, and theological deviation a threat to order. The emperor, standing above the debates, acted as arbiter, guardian of both church and state. That role would come to define Byzantine rulership for centuries. But unity came at a cost. Those deemed heretical were not merely wrong. They were dangerous. Communities fractured. Regions resisted imperial definitions of belief. Religious identity hardened, turning faith into a boundary rather than a bridge. What began as an instrument of cohesion risked becoming a source of unrest. Still, the momentum was unstoppable. Pagan temples fell into disuse or were repurposed. Christian symbols filled public spaces. Time itself was reordered around holy days and liturgical cycles. The rhythms of empire began to follow the rhythms of worship. Even language shifted, infused with theological meaning. Constantinople emerged not just as an imperial capital, but as a sacred city. Its churches gleamed beside palaces. Processions filled the streets with incense and chant. Imperial ceremonies blended political authority with religious symbolism, presenting the empire as a reflection of divine order. To live within the empire was to exist within a sacred hierarchy, where heaven and earth were believed to be aligned. Yet beneath this harmony, tensions simmered. The closer faith moved to power, the more it risked being reshaped by it. The emperor's influence over doctrine raised questions that had no easy answers. Where did spiritual authority end and political authority begin? Could faith remain pure when enforced by law? And what happened when emperors themselves disagreed on matters of belief? These questions would not remain theoretical for long. The sacred empire was still young. Its foundations newly laid. Faith had unified the state, but it had also introduced a volatile new dimension to imperial life. Belief could inspire loyalty beyond fear. It could also provoke resistance stronger than any army. As the empire stepped fully into its Christian identity, it stood at a crossroads. The union of faith and authority promised endurance, but it also ensured that future conflicts would be fought not only over land and power, but over the nature of truth itself. And in the centuries to come, theology would prove just as dangerous as invasion. As Christianity settled into the machinery of empire, belief ceased to be merely a matter of conscience. It became policy. What one believed, and how one believed it, now carried consequences that extended far beyond the soul. In Constantinople, theology and governance moved ever closer until the two became nearly indistinguishable. The emperor stood at the center of this convergence. He did not claim to be a priest, yet his authority reached deeply into the life of the church. He summoned councils, enforced their decisions, and exiled those who resisted them. His duty was not to define doctrine, but to ensure unity, and unity in a fragile empire was everything. To disagree too loudly was not simply to err, it was to endanger the state. Thus, doctrine became a battlefield. Theological disputes that might once have remained confined to monasteries or lecture halls now spilled into streets and provinces. Arguments over the nature of Christ, whether divine, human, or both, ignited passions that divided cities and regions. Crowds rallied behind rival bishops, monks marched in protest. Entire provinces aligned themselves with interpretations condemned by imperial authority. These were not abstract debates. They cut to the heart of identity. In Egypt and Syria, alternative theological traditions took root, shaped by local culture and long-standing suspicion of Constantinople's dominance. When imperial councils defined orthodoxy, many communities felt not unified, but conquered. What the court called heresy, they called truth. What the emperor called order, they experienced as oppression. The empire, once held together by roads and legions, was now bound by creed, and creeds could fracture. Yet the state pressed on. Councils multiplied, each attempting to resolve what the last had failed to settle. Creeds were refined, language sharpened, boundaries drawn ever more tightly around acceptable belief. The concept of orthodoxy hardened into something exclusive and enforceable. To be Roman increasingly meant to believe correctly. For the imperial administration, this rigidity offered clarity. Uniform belief simplified governance. It allowed loyalty to be measured, dissent to be identified, and unity to be proclaimed. The Church became an extension of imperial infrastructure, organizing communities, transmitting messages, reinforcing authority from pulpit to province. But clarity came with instability. Every definition created an opposition. Every enforced creed created exiles. Bishops deposed by imperial decree often returned as heroes to sympathetic populations. Persecuted groups did not vanish. They endured quietly or defiantly beyond the reach of Constantinople's walls. Faith, once a unifying force, now revealed its sharp edges. The emperor's role grew increasingly precarious. To rule effectively, he had to appear as the defender of true belief. Yet belief itself was contested, evolving, and deeply emotional. A misstep could cost him legitimacy. An unpopular doctrinal stance could spark rebellion as surely as a tax increase or military defeat. Thus, emperors learned to navigate theology with caution, sometimes conviction, sometimes calculation. Imperial ceremonies grew ever more sacred, reinforcing the image of divine favor. Victories were attributed to God's will. Defeats were explained as punishment for sin or disunity. The fate of the empire was framed as inseparable from its spiritual condition. Salvation and survival were intertwined. For ordinary citizens, this fusion shaped daily life. Church bells marked time. Sermons reinforced imperial messages. Icons and symbols filled homes and public spaces, reminding people that faith was not separate from authority. It surrounded them. To live within the empire was to live within a moral order defined by both scripture and law. Yet beneath the incense and ritual, fractures widened. Some regions grew distant from Constantinople, not just politically, but spiritually. The more the center imposed uniformity, the more the margins clung to difference. Faith became a language of resistance as much as obedience. The empire was learning a difficult lesson. Belief could not be commanded as easily as armies. Still, the union of faith and authority endured. Despite unrest and division, it provided the empire with something no purely secular system could offer: a sense of cosmic purpose. The Eastern Roman state did not merely govern territory. It claimed to uphold divine order in a fallen world. That claim gave it strength, but also bound its fate to questions no ruler could fully control. As centuries passed, the empire would face invasions, plagues, and political upheaval. Yet again and again, it would interpret these trials through a theological lens. Victory would affirm orthodoxy. Defeat would demand repentance. The sacred empire had been born. But its greatest challenges were still ahead, when belief itself would turn inward, challenging not only imperial authority, but the very symbols that define the faith. And when that moment arrived, the union of throne and altar would be tested as never before. By the time the Eastern Roman Empire entered the later centuries of late antiquity, the union of faith and authority was no longer an experiment. It was the empire's defining structure. What had begun as a strategy for unity had hardened into identity itself. To be Roman was to be Christian. To be Christian was to belong, at least in theory, to the imperial order safeguarded from Constantinople. Yet theory and reality rarely align for long. The sacred empire had achieved something extraordinary. It had survived the collapse of the ancient world by anchoring itself not only in walls and laws, but in meaning. Faith gave suffering a purpose. It gave defeat an explanation. It gave endurance a moral dimension. In an age of uncertainty, Christianity offered a story that made sense of chaos, and the empire made itself the guardian of that story. But this fusion also ensured that every crisis would now be spiritual as well as political. When famine struck, it was interpreted as divine displeasure. When enemies breached borders, sermons asked what sins had invited punishment. When emperors failed, their legitimacy was questioned not only as rulers, but as protectors of orthodoxy. Governance became a moral performance, judged by heaven as much as by history. This worldview reshaped imperial behavior. Emperors increasingly portrayed themselves as humble servants of God, even as their power grew more absolute. Public acts of repentance followed military setbacks. Laws were framed in moral language. Victory parades resembled religious processions. The state did not retreat from faith. It doubled down on it. At the heart of this system stood the belief that unity of doctrine ensured unity of empire. Yet the empire's vast diversity made this belief difficult to sustain. Regions with deep-rooted theological traditions resisted Constantinople's definitions. Egypt, Syria, and parts of Asia Minor developed religious identities that felt local, ancient, and authentic, often in opposition to imperial orthodoxy. What the court demanded as unity, these regions experienced as erasure. Thus, faith became both glue and wedge. Some communities remained fiercely loyal to the empire precisely because of shared belief. Others drifted away, their alienation reinforced by theological pressure. The empire, in seeking to bind itself together spiritually, inadvertently loosened its grip on parts of its own population. Still, the system endured because it offered something powerful. The Eastern Roman Empire did not promise its people freedom in the modern sense. It promised order. It promised meaning. It promised that history itself was not random, but guided. In a world where kingdoms rose and fell with brutal speed, this promise mattered. Constantinople embodied that promise. The city's ceremonies, chants, and architecture projected stability. Its churches were not merely places of worship, they were statements of permanence. Gold mosaics reflected candlelight, like fragments of heaven brought down to earth. The empire presented itself as a living icon, structured, hierarchical, and divinely sanctioned. Yet beneath this grandeur lay unresolved contradictions. By binding orthodoxy to power, the empire made belief a matter of loyalty. This discouraged dissent, but also stifled dialogue. Theology became rigid, guarded, and politicized. Creativity narrowed. Compromise became dangerous. When disputes arose, they were not resolved through gradual consensus, but through imperial decree. This rigidity would later prove costly. But for now, the sacred empire held. Its rulers believed sincerely that they were preserving truth itself. They saw no contradiction in enforcing belief, because belief was not merely personal. It was communal, cosmic, and civilizational. To allow doctrinal fragmentation was to invite chaos, not only in society, but in the universe as they understood it. Thus, Byzantium emerged fully formed as something unprecedented, a state that defined its survival in spiritual terms. Salvation and security became inseparable. The fate of souls and the fate of the empire were woven into the same narrative. Every generation inherited this worldview, reinforced through ritual, law, and education. And it worked, until it didn't. The union of faith and authority gave the empire resilience beyond that of its rivals. It also guaranteed that future conflicts would cut deeper than borders. When belief itself was challenged, the empire would be forced to confront a crisis not of territory, but of identity. That moment would come when images, symbols, and the nature of worship would ignite controversy so fierce it would shake the foundations of the sacred state. For now, Byzantium stood unified in faith and power, convinced that divine order protected its walls, its throne, and its future. But history is relentless, and the same faith that once bound the empire together would soon test whether unity, when enforced, could endure. Chapter 3. Justinian's Grand Vision. In the early 6th century, beneath the vaulted ceilings of Constantinople's imperial palace, a new kind of ambition took shape, one that looked not only to the future, but relentlessly to the past. The Roman Empire had survived, it had adapted, it had been sanctified, yet to one man, survival was not enough. His name was Justinian. Born far from the marble streets of Constantinople, Justinian rose not through ancient lineage, but through proximity to power and relentless discipline. When he ascended the throne, the empire he inherited was stable by comparison to the chaos that had destroyed the West, but it was smaller, cautious, and defensive. For most emperors, this would have been victory enough. For Justinian, it was unfinished business. In the dawn of his reign, the memory of Rome's lost provinces still haunted the imperial imagination. Italy, North Africa, and much of the western Mediterranean, once Roman heartlands, now lay under the rule of Germanic kings. They governed in Rome's shadow, using Roman titles, Roman law, and Roman prestige, yet standing outside imperial control. To Justinian, this was an intolerable contradiction. Rome was not meant to be remembered. It was meant to rule. Beneath the shadow of empires long fallen, Justinian envisioned nothing less than restoration, not merely territorial expansion, but the reassembly of a world that had fractured. The empire would be whole again, politically, legally, and spiritually. Constantinople would not just preserve Rome's legacy, it would reclaim it. This vision demanded more than armies. The empire Justinian sought to restore required order, clear, universal, unchallenged. Over centuries, Roman law had grown vast and contradictory, layered with decrees, precedents, and regional interpretations. For an emperor obsessed with unity, this legal chaos was a threat. Thus began one of the most ambitious intellectual projects in imperial history. Under Justinian's authority, scholars were tasked with collecting, organizing, and refining centuries of Roman law. What emerged was not merely a legal code, but a statement of imperial identity. Law was declared rational, systematic, and absolute, an expression of both Roman tradition and divine order. Justice flowed from the emperor as it always had, but now with unprecedented clarity. In Justinian's empire, law would no longer drift with time. It would be fixed, eternal, like Rome itself. Yet even as parchment was inked in quiet halls, the world beyond the palace was restless. The empire's resources were immense, but finite. Funding legal reform, monumental construction, and military ambition required relentless taxation. Provinces felt the weight of Justinian's vision long before they saw its rewards. Officials enforced fiscal discipline with little tolerance for resistance. Stability, Justinian believed, demanded sacrifice, and sacrifice bred resentment. Within Constantinople, tensions simmered between social classes, political factions, and religious groups. Chariot racing teams, the Blues and the Greens, were more than sporting rivals. They were conduits for political expression, grievance, and identity. In the crowded hippodrome, cheers masked anger, and celebration hovered close to riot. Justinian, confident in divine favor and imperial authority, underestimated how fragile order could be. Beyond the capital, the wider world watched. To the east, the Persian Empire remained a powerful and vigilant rival. Along the empire's borders, peace was never permanent, only negotiated. Any Western ambition would require stability elsewhere. Justinian knew this. His vision demanded simultaneous control, a balancing act few emperors had ever mastered. Still, momentum carried him forward. The emperor presented himself as God's chosen restorer of Roman order. His reign was framed as providential. Coinage, laws, and ceremonies reinforced the image of a ruler destined to complete history's unfinished chapter. This was not conquest for glory. It was reclamation. From the ashes of ruin, Justinian intended to raise Rome again. Yet the higher the vision, the greater the risk. To restore an empire long divided required more than faith and intellect. It required force, it required endurance, and it required a tolerance for catastrophe. As the 6th century advanced, Justinian stood at the threshold of action. His legal foundations were laid, his authority was secure, his dream was clear. But history rarely bends without resistance. The empire was about to learn whether restoration was possible, or whether the attempt itself would reshape Byzantium in ways no one could foresee. The dream of restoration did not unfold gently. It erupted. In the heart of Constantinople, beneath the towering stands of the Hippodrome, the first great test of Justinian's reign arrived not from foreign enemies, but from his own people. What began as another chariot race spiraled into something far more dangerous. Political grievances, economic strain, and factional hatred fused into a single cry that echoed through the capital: revolt. The Nika riots consumed the city with terrifying speed. Crowds surged through the streets, setting fire to buildings, toppling statues, and proclaiming a rival emperor. For days, Constantinople burned. Smoke darkened the sky above the Bosporus. The old structures of Roman authority, so carefully preserved, teetered on the edge of collapse. Justinian himself wavered, contemplating flight as the city he ruled descended into chaos. It was here, amid fear and flame, that the true cost of imperial vision revealed itself. Advised to stand firm, Justinian chose blood over retreat. Troops were unleashed into the hippodrome, trapping tens of thousands of rebels inside. By the end, the arena was silent, its sand soaked with death. Order was restored, but the message was unmistakable. Restoration would tolerate no resistance. From the ashes of rebellion, Justinian rebuilt on an even grander scale. The destroyed heart of Constantinople became the canvas for imperial ambition. Rising where churches once stood, a new structure took shape, vast, luminous, unprecedented. Hagia Sophia was not merely a place of worship, it was a declaration. Its dome seemed to float between heaven and earth, light cascading across marble and gold. To those who entered, it felt as though the divine itself had descended into stone. Justinian had survived his first trial. Now he turned outward. The Western reconquests began with calculated precision. In North Africa, imperial forces struck the Vandal kingdom with speed and discipline. Ancient Roman provinces, lost for nearly a century, fell back under imperial banners. Carthage was reclaimed. The Mediterranean, long fractured, felt Roman control return to its waters. Encouraged, Justinian pressed further. Italy, the symbolic heart of Rome, became the next objective. What followed was not swift victory, but prolonged devastation. Cities changed hands repeatedly. Fields were trampled. Civilian populations suffered as imperial ambition collided with harsh reality. Rome itself was besieged, liberated, and besieged again, its ancient glory reduced to a battlefield. Victory, when it came, was hollow. Italy returned to imperial control, but shattered. Its economy lay in ruins, its population diminished. The cost of restoration exceeded its immediate rewards. What had been reclaimed in name was lost in substance. Even as armies marched west, disaster struck from an unseen direction. A deadly plague swept through the empire, arriving by ship and spreading with merciless efficiency. Cities emptied, commerce stalled, fields went unharvested. The disease spared no class, no region. Even the emperor himself fell ill, surviving while countless others did not. The empire bled, not from swords, but from silence. Manpower dwindled, tax revenues collapsed, military campaigns strained under the weight of loss. Yet Justinian did not abandon his vision. He pressed on, convinced that Providence tested those chosen for greatness. To the east, war with Persia flared and faded in cycles of exhaustion. Fortunes shifted. Treaties were signed, broken, and signed again. The empire fought on multiple fronts, its resources stretched thinner with every passing year. Still, the emperor ruled with unwavering conviction. He believed history would justify him, that future generations would see beyond the suffering to the achievement, that Rome, restored even imperfectly, was worth the price. Yet even as banners flew over reclaimed territories, the empire beneath them was changing. The machinery of government grew heavier. Taxation became harsher. Local autonomy eroded. What Justinian gained in territory, he risked losing in resilience. The empire was once adaptive and cautious. Now it was strained, centralized, and overextended. The dream of restoration had been realized in part, but at immense cost. As the 6th century wore on, cracks began to appear in the imperial foundation. The world Justinian sought to restore no longer existed in the form he imagined. and the empire he reshaped to pursue that dream would inherit consequences long after his reign ended. Yet the story was not finished. For Justinian's legacy would not be measured only in conquest and catastrophe, but in how his vision redefined what Byzantium believed it could be. By the final years of Justinian's reign, the Roman world had been altered in ways no single ruler before him had achieved. The empire stretched once more across the Mediterranean, its banners flying over North Africa, Italy, and parts of southern Spain. In maps and proclamations, Rome appeared whole again. The dream that had driven Justinian from the beginning had, in form at least, been realized. Yet beneath the surface the empire told a more complicated story. The lands reclaimed by conquest were exhausted. Italy, once the beating heart of the Roman world, lay scarred by decades of warfare. Cities were depopulated, infrastructure decayed. Imperial administration struggled to extract revenue from provinces that barely survived. The Mediterranean unity Justinian sought existed more on parchment than in daily life. The emperor, aging and increasingly isolated, ruled over an empire that was larger, but weaker. The cost of his ambition had been immense. The treasury strained under the weight of war and reconstruction. The population, already battered by plague, struggled beneath heavy taxation. The army, once flexible and responsive, was now overstretched, defending distant frontiers with diminishing manpower. The empire had regained territory, but lost the margin for error that had once sustained it. Yet Justinian's reign cannot be measured solely by what it consumed. His most enduring legacy lay not in the lands he reclaimed, but in the foundations he laid. The legal reforms of his era preserved Roman law with clarity and authority unmatched in earlier centuries. Long after the empire's borders receded, these laws would shape governance across Europe and beyond, influencing kingdoms that had never known Roman rule directly. In stone and mortar, Justinian reshaped Constantinople into a capital worthy of his vision. Hagia Sophia stood as both triumph and warning. Proof of what imperial power could create and what it demanded. Its vast dome symbolized divine favor, yet its existence was born from rebellion, bloodshed, and relentless taxation. Spiritually, Justinian reinforced the fusion of faith and authority. Orthodoxy was defined, enforced, and elevated. The emperor's role as defender of true belief became inseparable from the concept of rulership itself. This strengthened imperial cohesion, but also deepened the empire's reliance on theological unity, setting the stage for future internal conflicts. When Justinian died, the empire he left behind stood at a crossroads. It was richer in monuments and law, but poorer in resilience. It had reached backward to reclaim Rome, even as the world moved forward into something new. The ancient Mediterranean order he sought to restore was already giving way to emerging powers and new forms of warfare. Within a generation, much of what Justinian had reclaimed would be lost again. Yet to dismiss his reign as failure would miss its deeper significance. Justinian did not merely attempt to restore Rome. He redefined what Byzantium believed itself to be. His vision affirmed that the empire was not a remnant, nor a caretaker of ruins. It was an active, ambitious power with a universal mission. That belief would endure, shaping Byzantine policy for centuries to come. In the long arc of history, Justinian stands as a paradox. He was both preserver and disruptor, builder and destroyer, visionary and burden. His reign marked the final attempt to unify the ancient world under Roman authority, and in doing so, accelerated the empire's transformation into something distinctly medieval. From his triumphs and catastrophes emerged a Byzantium no longer chasing the past, but forced to confront a harsher future. And as the empire turned inward to survive the consequences of grand ambition, new trials approached, unseen, unstoppable, and indifferent to human design. For beyond the palaces and walls of Constantinople, forces were gathering that no law code, no dome of stone, no memory of Rome could hold at bay. Chapter 4. Plague, Fire, and Survival. In the wake of Justinian's grand ambitions, the Eastern Roman Empire stood exposed, its borders extended, its resources strained, its people exhausted. The dream of restoration had demanded everything the empire could give. What followed would demand even more. The 6th century did not reward overreach with mercy. Even before the final echoes of conquest faded, an invisible enemy crossed the empire's frontiers. It arrived quietly, carried by ships that once brought grain and commerce into Constantinople's harbors. From Egypt, along the arteries of trade and empire, disease crept northward, unseen, unstoppable, and indifferent to rank or power. When the plague reached the capital, it struck with devastating force. Streets once filled with merchants and officials fell silent. Homes were sealed. Bodies accumulated faster than they could be buried. The sound of carts carrying the dead replaced the noise of daily life. Clergy prayed openly in the streets as physicians stood powerless, unable to explain what was happening, let alone stop it. This was not a single outbreak. It returned again and again, generation after generation, each wave carving deeper scars into the imperial body. The population collapsed. Farmers vanished from the fields. Artisans disappeared from workshops. Soldiers died in garrisons meant to defend the frontier. Tax registers no longer reflected reality, yet demands remained unchanged. The machinery of empire, designed for abundance, struggled to function in an age of loss. Even the emperor was not spared. Justinian himself fell ill, his survival seen by many as proof of divine favor. Yet for countless others, there was no miracle. Entire families vanished, cities shrank. The empire that had once expanded through discipline and planning now faced an enemy that obeyed no command. Fire followed disease. As population declined, maintenance faltered. Infrastructure decayed. Urban fires, once swiftly contained, raged unchecked. Districts burned, not from invasion, but from neglect. Water systems failed. Grain supplies faltered. What had been the most sophisticated urban network in the ancient world began to fray. Beyond the cities, the countryside changed. Abandoned villages returned to wilderness. Roads fell into disrepair. Fortifications stood undermanned. The empire's carefully balanced system, taxes supporting armies, armies protecting provinces, entered a vicious cycle of decline. Fewer people meant fewer resources. Fewer resources meant weaker defenses. And weakness invited pressure. Along the borders, enemies watched closely. Slavic groups crossed into the Balkans, settling lands once firmly Roman. In the east, Persia tested imperial resolve, exploiting moments of vulnerability. The empire could no longer respond with overwhelming force. It fought cautiously, defensively, often reactively. Yet Byzantium did not collapse. This was its defining difference. Where the Western Empire had fragmented under similar pressures, the Eastern Empire endured, wounded, diminished, but unbroken. Its survival was not accidental. It rested on habits forged through centuries of adaptation, centralized authority, bureaucratic continuity, and an unyielding belief in imperial order. The state adjusted. Taxes were restructured. military deployments shifted toward defense. Fortresses became refuges for local populations. Emperors abandoned dreams of expansion and focused on preservation. Survival replaced restoration as the empire's guiding principle. Faith deepened. In an age of suffering, religion offered meaning when reason failed. Plague was interpreted as divine trial. Survival became evidence of grace. Processions filled the streets once more, not in celebration, but supplication. The empire leaned harder into its identity as a sacred order sustained by God's will. Constantinople remained standing, its walls intact, its administration functioning, its authority recognized even when challenged. It was battered, but it held. And in that endurance lay something remarkable. The empire was no longer the confident heir of Rome's ancient dominance. It was becoming something else, a state shaped by crisis, disciplined by loss, and hardened by survival. Its institutions bent, but did not break. Its identity narrowed, but solidified. From the ashes of fire and the silence left by plague, Byzantium learned a brutal lesson, that survival was not glorious, but it was possible. The ancient world had ended. What remained was an empire forced to reinvent itself under constant pressure, learning to live with fewer people, fewer resources, and fewer illusions. The coming centuries would demand even harsher choices. But for now, the empire still breathed, scarred, reduced, enduring. And as the shadows lengthened across the 6th century, Byzantium prepared for a future where resilience, not ambition, would determine whether it lived or vanished like so many empires before it. As the waves of plague receded and returned, the Eastern Roman Empire entered a long, grinding struggle, not for dominance, but for coherence. The age of grand campaigns had ended. In its place emerged an era defined by endurance, improvisation, and hard choices made far from glory. The empire was shrinking, not only in territory, but in capacity. With populations reduced and revenues diminished, the old Roman model of governance became unsustainable. The state could no longer afford vast standing armies or elaborate civilian administrations spread evenly across provinces. What had once been a system built for expansion now had to function under scarcity. So the empire adapted again. Military organization shifted first. Rather than concentrating forces for distant campaigns, troops were increasingly settled within the provinces they defended. Soldiers became farmers in peacetime, defenders in crisis. Land grants replaced salaries that the treasury could no longer reliably pay. Defense became local, flexible, and rooted in survival rather than conquest. This transformation was not yet fully formed, but its foundations were being laid. Fortresses multiplied across the landscape. Cities contracted inward, abandoning ancient suburbs to strengthen defensible cores. Walls became the defining feature of urban life. Safety replaced splendor. Function replaced ornament. In the countryside, power became more localized. Imperial authority still existed, but its presence was uneven. Local elites, landowners, bishops, military commanders, assumed greater responsibility for maintaining order and provisioning defense. The empire did not fragment, but it decentralized in practice, even as it remained centralized in theory. Constantinople, however, retained its primacy. The capital continued to receive grain shipments, though less reliably than before. Its walls, repaired and expanded, stood as the empire's ultimate refuge. While provincial cities declined, Constantinople endured as a living symbol of imperial continuity. Even reduced, it dwarfed most cities of the age in size, wealth, and organization. To friend and foe alike, its survival mattered. Beyond the empire's borders, Pressure intensified. In the Balkans, new populations settled permanently, no longer content with raids alone. Roman control weakened in regions once firmly integrated into imperial life. The old provincial order dissolved into a patchwork of imperial strongholds surrounded by contested countryside. To the east, Persia remained a persistent threat, organized, wealthy, and keenly aware of Byzantine vulnerability. Wars flared intermittently, draining resources both sides could scarcely afford. Neither empire could achieve decisive victory. Exhaustion became the defining condition of conflict. The empire's response was not collapse, but recalibration. Diplomacy grew more sophisticated. Tribute replaced conquest. Alliances were forged with former enemies. The state learned to manipulate rivalries beyond its borders, using gold and negotiation where armies could no longer prevail. Survival increasingly depended on intelligence, patience, and timing. Faith continued to frame these struggles. Sermons interpreted invasions as tests of endurance. Victories, however small, were celebrated as signs of divine favor. Defeats prompted calls for repentance rather than rebellion. The sacred narrative of the empire softened the psychological blow of decline, allowing people to endure conditions that might otherwise have shattered loyalty. Yet faith alone could not feed armies or repair walls. The empire became ruthlessly pragmatic. Regions that could not be defended were quietly abandoned. Resources were concentrated where they mattered most. The illusion of universal Roman control was slowly replaced by a more realistic strategy. Defend what could be held, adapt what could not. This was survival stripped of romance. And still, Byzantium held together. The administrative spine of the empire, its records, its legal traditions, its taxation systems, never fully disappeared. Even diminished, they provided continuity where other states disintegrated. The idea of empire remained intact, even as its physical reach contracted. This distinction mattered, because while many kingdoms rose and fell in this era, Byzantium endured as a recognizable state, governed, administered, and self-aware. It did not reinvent itself overnight, but it refused to vanish. The 6th century closed not with triumph, but with stabilization. The empire that emerged was smaller, poorer, and more cautious. It no longer sought to restore the ancient world. It sought to outlast it. And in that shift, from ambition to endurance, Byzantium found a new identity. But history was not finished testing it. For even as the empire learned to survive plague and decline, forces beyond its borders were undergoing transformations of their own, faster, more radical, and destined to reshape the world Byzantium struggled to preserve. Those forces were gathering momentum. And when they arrived, survival itself would be tested anew. By the close of the 6th century, the Eastern Roman Empire no longer resembled the world it had once ruled. The Mediterranean unity that had defined antiquity was gone, replaced by fractured regions, shifting populations, and states built on survival rather than supremacy. Yet amid this transformation, Byzantium remained, changed, constrained, but alive. This survival was not accidental. It was ideological. The empire's ruling class internalized a new truth. Endurance itself was a virtue. No longer measured by expansion or universal dominion, imperial success came to be defined by continuity. If the empire endured through plague, invasion, fire, and famine, then it had fulfilled its purpose. This belief reshaped how Byzantium understood history. The past was no longer a blueprint to be restored, but a warning to be heeded. The empire had reached too far, too fast, and paid the price. Now, restraint replaced ambition. Flexibility replaced certainty. Survival replaced glory. Administratively, this mindset hardened into policy. Imperial authority remained centralized in theory, but adaptable in practice. Officials were empowered to make local decisions. Military commanders balanced diplomacy with force. The state tolerated ambiguity where once it had demanded uniformity. This pragmatism, born of crisis, became a defining Byzantine trait. The empire learned when to fight, when to retreat, and when to negotiate. Culturally, the trauma of the 6th century left deep marks. Art grew more symbolic, less naturalistic, reflecting a world that felt fragile and transitory. Architecture emphasized fortification over ornament. Literature turned inward, focused on morality, providence, and endurance. The optimism of classical antiquity faded, replaced by a sober awareness of human limitation. Faith absorbed this shift. Christianity, already central to imperial identity, became more introspective. Suffering was no longer exceptional. It was expected. The empire saw itself as a chosen people tested by God, refined through hardship rather than rewarded with ease. This theology of endurance offered psychological resilience in an age when material security could no longer be guaranteed. In Constantinople, this worldview found its strongest expression. The capital stood as both sanctuary and symbol. Its walls, repaired again and again, represented more than defense. They embodied the empire's will to persist. So long as Constantinople stood, the empire lived. Its survival validated the belief that order could be preserved even as the world unraveled. Yet this focus carried consequences. As resources narrowed, imperial priorities sharpened. Peripheral regions were increasingly left to fend for themselves. The empire became more compact, more defensible, but also more insular. It survived, but at the cost of breadth and influence. Still, survival was victory enough. While other remnants of the Roman world dissolved into successor kingdoms, Byzantium endured as a continuous state, its institutions intact, its identity coherent, its memory unbroken. This continuity allowed it to act as a bridge between eras, preserving administrative knowledge, legal tradition, and classical learning through centuries of upheaval. The empire was no longer the ruler of the world. It had become its witness. As the 7th century approached, the Eastern Roman Empire stood poised between eras, no longer ancient, not yet fully medieval. It carried within it the scars of catastrophe and the hard-earned wisdom of survival. It had learned that history did not reward certainty, only adaptability. But new challenges loomed beyond the horizon. The world outside Byzantium was changing faster than ever before. Societies once fragmented by Rome's collapse were reorganizing, new identities were forming, new powers were emerging, driven by conviction, mobility, and belief as powerful as any Byzantium had known. The empire, for all its resilience, could not yet see what was coming. But it would soon learn that plague and fire had been only the beginning. For beyond its borders, a force was rising that would not merely raid or pressure the empire, but redefine the world it struggled to preserve. And when that force arrived, Byzantium's doctrine of survival would face its most severe test yet. Chapter 5. The Rise of New Rivals. As the 7th century dawned, the world beyond Byzantium's walls no longer resembled the fractured landscape Rome had once dominated. The silence left by plague and collapse did not last forever. Across deserts, steppes, and highlands, societies long shaped by Rome's presence or absence were reorganizing themselves with new purpose. While Byzantium focused inward, mastering the art of survival, the wider world was preparing to move. Beneath the shadow of empires, power was changing hands. To the north and west, the Balkans had transformed beyond recognition. Slavic communities settled permanently in lands once administered by Roman officials. Villages replaced cities. Local customs displaced imperial order. Byzantium still claimed these territories in theory, but control was uneven, negotiated, and fragile. The empire's borders became zones of interaction rather than lines of command. In the east, the ancient rival of Rome still stood. The Persian Empire, governed by its own imperial tradition and hardened by centuries of conflict with Rome, remained a formidable presence. Its armies were disciplined, its administration resilient. Between Constantinople and Persia stretched contested lands scarred by decades of warfare, frontiers defined less by treaties than by exhaustion. Neither empire could deliver a decisive blow. Each waited for the other to falter. But the most profound transformation was occurring farther south, beyond the empire's habitual gaze. In the Arabian Peninsula, a region long dismissed by imperial strategists as peripheral and fragmented, change was accelerating. Trade routes crossed its deserts, linking Africa, the Mediterranean, and Asia. Tribal networks governed movement and loyalty. For centuries, this world had existed at the margins of imperial power, connected but not controlled. That was about to change. Economic and social pressures were reshaping Arabian society. Old tribal rivalries coexisted with increasing contact with Byzantine and Persian worlds. Ideas, beliefs, and goods flowed through caravan routes. Monotheistic traditions, Christian, Jewish, and others, were already present, debated, and adapted within local contexts. The conditions for transformation were in place. While Byzantium struggled to stabilize after generations of crisis, its neighbors were not standing still. They were learning, adapting, consolidating, and unlike the empire, they were not burdened by centuries of infrastructure to maintain or traditions to preserve. They were free to move. Within Byzantium, few grasped the significance of these changes. The empire's worldview remained anchored in familiar patterns. Invasions would come from the north or east, as they always had. Rivals would resemble Persians or steppe nomads. Threats would announce themselves gradually, offering time for response. This assumption had shaped imperial defense for generations. It would soon prove dangerously outdated. Even as Constantinople repaired walls and balanced its books, a new kind of power was emerging, one driven not merely by territory or wealth, but by belief. This belief did not seek coexistence with imperial tradition. It sought to reorder the world. Yet at first, there were no alarms. Trade continued. Diplomacy functioned. Border skirmishes flared and faded. The empire, weary from survival, mistook quiet for stability. It believed it had endured the worst history could offer. In truth, it had only survived the prelude. Byzantium's greatest strength, its caution, was becoming a vulnerability. Years of contraction had sharpened its defensive instincts, but dulled its sense of possibility beyond known threats. The empire had mastered how to endure decline. It had not yet learned how to confront transformation happening elsewhere. As the 7th century progressed, events would unfold with astonishing speed. Within a single generation, provinces that had remained Roman since the age of Augustus would be lost. Cities that had survived plague and fire would fall without siege. Regions bound to Constantinople by law faith and memory would slip beyond imperial reach, not through gradual decay, but sudden rupture. The empire would face rivals unlike any it had known before, not heirs of Rome, not imitators of its institutions, but challengers born from a new vision of order, one that moved faster, believed more fiercely, and adapted more ruthlessly than the empire that had survived everything else. By the time Byzantium understood what was happening, the world it struggled to preserve would already be changing. And survival, once again, would demand transformation. The first signs of upheaval reached Byzantium not as catastrophe, but as confusion. Reports arrived from the empire's southern frontiers, disjointed, uncertain, easy to underestimate. Raids in the Levant. Garrisons overwhelmed not by vast armies, but by forces that moved with alarming speed and cohesion. Cities surrendered with little resistance. Provinces that had endured centuries of Roman rule changed hands in months. At first, imperial officials struggled to name the threat. These were not Persians, not steppe nomads, not rebels seeking accommodation within the imperial system. They did not demand Roman titles or imperial recognition. They came with a message that rejected the very framework Byzantium relied upon to understand power. The empire was facing a force animated by belief. From the Arabian Peninsula emerged armies bound not by dynastic loyalty or imperial bureaucracy, but by a shared religious conviction that fused spiritual purpose with political expansion. This belief offered clarity, momentum, and unity in ways Byzantium had not encountered before. Where the empire relied on layered administration and negotiation, this new power relied on speed, discipline, and absolute commitment. The timing could not have been worse. Byzantium was exhausted. Decades of war with Persia had drained both empires to the brink. Border fortresses were undermanned. Populations were diminished. Loyalty in the provinces was fragile, weakened by heavy taxation and lingering theological divisions. Many communities felt distant from Constantinople, bound by law but disconnected in spirit. When imperial defenses faltered, the collapse was swift. Syria fell. Egypt, once the empire's most vital grain supplier, slipped from Byzantine control. The loss was not merely territorial, it was existential. Constantinople depended on Egypt's harvest to feed its population. Without them, the capital's survival was suddenly uncertain. Cities that had survived plague, fire, and Persian invasion now changed rulers without prolonged resistance. This was not always betrayal. Often, it was calculation. The new rulers promised lower taxes, religious tolerance for certain communities, and an end to the exhausting cycle of imperial warfare. For populations worn down by crisis, these terms were persuasive. Byzantium, for all its endurance, struggled to inspire loyalty equal to that of its new rival's certainty. The empire reeled. Within a decade, centuries of Roman presence in the Eastern Mediterranean were erased. Provinces that had shaped imperial identity since antiquity were gone. The sacred geography of Byzantium, Jerusalem, Antioch, Alexandria, passed beyond its reach. The loss struck not only at the empire's resources, but at its sense of divine favor. How could a sacred empire lose lands so integral to its spiritual narrative? Imperial thinkers searched for answers. Some blamed theological division. Others blamed moral failure. Still others saw the defeats as divine chastisement, a call to reform rather than despair. What united these interpretations was the assumption that survival depended not on returning to old strategies, but on redefining what the empire was. And redefine it they did. Byzantium withdrew into its core territories. Anatolia and the Balkans, regions more defensible, more cohesive, and less exposed to rapid conquest. The empire abandoned the illusion of universal dominion. In its place emerged a smaller, harder state oriented toward permanent defense. The transformation was brutal but effective. Cities were reorganized around military needs. Civilian and military authority merged at local levels. Communities became garrison societies, their survival tied directly to defense. The empire became lean, reactive, and intensely focused on protecting what remained. Constantinople once again became the fulcrum of history. Its walls, tested, repaired, and reinforced, stood between the empire and annihilation. The capital endured sieges, blockades, and famine. Each survival reinforced the belief that the city was divinely protected, even as the empire around it contracted. Meanwhile, the new power did not fade. It consolidated, organized, expanded. It adapted to governing vast territories as swiftly as it had conquered them. It absorbed the administrative practices of Byzantium and Persia alike, learning even as it replaced. The empire was no longer facing temporary rivals. It was confronting a reordered world. For Byzantium, the shock forced a reckoning. The age of inherited dominance was over. The empire could no longer assume continuity as a given. Survival would now depend on permanent vigilance, rapid adaptation, and the willingness to abandon long-held assumptions. The Eastern Roman Empire had survived plague and fire. Now it faced transformation driven by belief as potent as its own, and far less burdened by the weight of history. The struggle ahead would define Byzantium not as Rome reborn, but as a frontier state standing between worlds. And in that struggle, endurance would once again be tested, not by slow decay, but by relentless momentum. By the middle of the 7th century, the Eastern Roman Empire had been transformed by defeat more radically than by any victory it had ever known. The shock of sudden conquest did not merely strip Byzantium of territory, it shattered the assumptions upon which its world had been built. The empire that emerged from this crisis was no longer the steward of the ancient Mediterranean. It was something new, compact, militarized, and forged by permanent threat. Loss became instruction. The provinces that fell, Syria, Egypt, Palestine, had once been pillars of imperial wealth, culture, and spiritual identity. Their disappearance forced Byzantium to confront a brutal reality. The sacred empire was not immune to history. Divine favor, once assumed, could no longer be taken for granted. Survival now required action, not explanation. In response, the empire reinvented itself with remarkable speed. Administrative systems were dismantled and rebuilt around defense. Civil authority fused with military command at the local level, ensuring rapid response to invasion. Soldiers were settled on land they were expected to defend, binding survival of family, farm, and frontier into a single purpose. This was not merely reform, it was reinvention born of necessity. The empire became a state at war with time. Anatolia emerged as the new heartland, its rugged terrain providing depth and resilience. Fortified towns replaced vulnerable cities. Roads served armies rather than commerce. Life became harder, narrower, but more sustainable. Byzantium no longer sought to dominate trade routes, it sought to deny access to enemies. Constantinople stood as the ultimate line of defense. Encircled by walls that had already outlasted centuries, the capital endured siege after siege. Famine threatened, supplies dwindled. Yet the city did not fall. Its survival became mythic even to its enemies, a symbol that the empire, however reduced, still possessed an unbreakable core. Faith adapted alongside strategy. The loss of holy cities forced Byzantium to redefine its spiritual geography. Constantinople became not just the political center of the empire, but its sacred heart. The emperor remained God's chosen ruler, not because he commanded the world, but because he defended the remnant entrusted to him. Holiness was no longer measured by possession of sacred land, but by endurance under trial. This shift hardened Byzantine identity. The empire became more inward-looking, more defensive, more suspicious of difference. Uniformity was prized. Loyalty was demanded. The trauma of loss made compromise feel dangerous. Survival required cohesion, and cohesion required discipline. Yet even as Byzantium contracted, it endured where others vanished. Its institutions remained intact. Its legal memory persisted. Its administrative competence, though simplified, continued to function. While new powers expanded rapidly, Byzantium learned how to resist them, how to absorb blows without shattering. This was not the empire of Augustus or Justinian. It was tougher, poorer, more focused. And it would last. The new rivals that reshaped the world had momentum, conviction, and reach. But Byzantium possessed something equally powerful: experience. It had survived collapse, reinvention, and loss before. Now it applied those lessons with ruthless clarity. The empire that emerged from the 7th century crisis was no longer ancient. It was medieval. Its survival marked the true end of antiquity and the beginning of a new era in which Byzantium would stand as a fortress civilization, holding back forces that would otherwise reshape Europe entirely. From this crucible came an empire that no longer chased Rome's shadow. It stood in its own. Smaller, yes, but disciplined, resilient, and self-aware. An empire defined not by what it had lost, but by what it refused to surrender. And as the dust of conquest settled, Byzantium prepared for a future of constant defense, where identity, belief, and power would be tested not by expansion, but by endurance. Chapter 6: Iconoclasm and Identity. In the aftermath of conquest and contraction, Byzantium entered a period of uneasy survival. The empire had endured loss on a scale unmatched in its history, yet it still stood, defiant, disciplined, and deeply convinced that endurance itself was proof of divine purpose. But survival bred introspection, and introspection in a sacred empire inevitably turned inward toward belief. By the early 8th century, a question long whispered at the edges of theology moved to the center of imperial life. How should the divine be represented? For generations, images had filled Byzantine churches and homes. Christ, the Virgin, saints, martyrs, rendered in paint, mosaic, and gold, gazed down from domes and walls. These icons were not merely art. They were windows into heaven, conduits of presence, objects of reverence that shaped daily devotion. To touch an icon was to reach toward the sacred. To pray before one was to stand at the threshold between earth and eternity. But after decades of catastrophe, some began to wonder whether these images were no longer signs of favor, but causes of punishment. The empire had lost holy cities. Sacred lands had fallen. Enemies who rejected images entirely now ruled territories Byzantium had held since antiquity. To many, this contrast felt impossible to ignore. Had the empire offended God by allowing sacred representations to become idols? Had devotion crossed the line into disobedience? These questions did not emerge from abstraction. They arose from trauma. Defeat demanded explanation, and in Byzantium explanation was always theological. Within the imperial court, suspicion toward icons grew. Emperors, burdened by responsibility for both souls and state, searched for causes they could control. Military failure, economic strain, and territorial loss were difficult to reverse. Religious practice, however, could be corrected, regulated, purified, enforced. Thus began a conflict that would tear through Byzantine society for over a century. The debate over icons was not merely about images. It was about authority, identity, and the meaning of survival. At its core lay a dangerous question. Who had the right to define orthodoxy, the church, tradition, or the emperor? Those who opposed religious images argued from scripture and reason. God was infinite, uncreated, beyond human depiction. To represent the divine in material form was to reduce it, to misunderstand it, to risk idolatry. In an empire that believed its fate depended on divine approval, this argument carried terrifying weight. Others defended icons with equal conviction. They argued that God had already taken visible form through incarnation. If the divine had entered the material world, then representation was not only permissible, it was necessary. Icons did not replace God. They pointed toward him. To destroy them was to deny the very mystery of salvation. Between these positions stood the emperor. Unlike earlier theological disputes resolved through councils, this conflict unfolded under direct imperial intervention. Emperors issued decrees. Images were removed from churches. Mosaics were defaced. Monasteries, centers of icon devotion, were targeted. Resistance was met with exile, imprisonment, or worse. What had once been devotion became defiance. Monks hid icons. Communities resisted officials. Theologians wrote in secrecy. Streets echoed not with celebration, but confrontation. The empire's unity, so hard-won through survival, fractured along lines of belief. Iconoclasm, the rejection and destruction of icons, was not merely a religious reform. It was a political act. By challenging entrenched traditions, emperors asserted dominance over the church. By weakening monastic influence, they reasserted central authority. In the name of purification, power was redistributed and contested. The result was instability within endurance. The empire survived external pressure only to face internal rupture. Faith, once the glue of Byzantine identity, now became its fault line. Loyalty was questioned. Orthodoxy was redefined by decree. Belief became an instrument of control. Yet even as images fell, the empire held. This paradox defined Byzantium. It could fracture without collapsing. It could endure contradiction without dissolving. The icon controversy would not destroy the empire, but it would permanently reshape how Byzantium understood itself. The question of images forced the empire to confront something deeper than article. It was being asked to decide what kind of sacred state it truly was, and who had the authority to decide. And as this struggle intensified, it would draw every layer of Byzantine society into conflict: emperor and monk, soldier and priest, tradition and command. The empire had survived conquest. Now it would test whether it could survive itself. The struggle over icons did not remain confined to theology. It spilled into every corner of Byzantine life, turning belief into a measure of loyalty and transforming devotion into resistance. What had begun as a question of worship became a test of obedience, one that forced the empire to confront the limits of imperial authority over the sacred. At the center of the storm stood the emperor. In earlier centuries, emperors had guided doctrine cautiously, presenting themselves as protectors of consensus. Now they acted decisively. Decrees against icons were issued with the force of law. Churches were ordered to remove images. Public displays of sacred art were condemned. What had once been expressions of faith were recast as violations of divine command. Imperial officials enforced these policies with varying degrees of zeal. In some cities, icons vanished quietly. In others, their removal provoked outrage. Mosaics were scraped from walls, frescoes were whitewashed, shrines were dismantled. The visual language of Byzantine devotion, so integral to its identity, was systematically erased from public space. Resistance followed swiftly. Monasteries became centers of opposition. Monks, long revered as spiritual exemplars, refused compliance. They argued that no emperor, however powerful, could override tradition sanctified by centuries of practice. To them, iconoclasm was not reform. It was sacrilege. The empire responded with force. Monastic lands were confiscated. Communities were dispersed. Leaders were exiled. Some were imprisoned. Others disappeared. The conflict grew bitter, personal, and enduring. Families were divided. Cities polarized. Loyalty to the emperor no longer guaranteed loyalty to his faith. For ordinary Byzantines, the turmoil was disorienting. Faith had once been a source of comfort amid uncertainty. Now it was a cause of fear. To display an icon could invite punishment. To destroy one could invite condemnation. Silence became a survival strategy. Belief retreated from public view, practiced cautiously within homes and hidden spaces. The empire, already hardened by external threats, was now fractured internally. Yet the iconoclastic policy persisted, not because it was universally accepted, but because it served imperial needs. By weakening monastic institutions, emperors reclaimed resources and influence. By asserting authority over worship, they reinforced the idea that the emperor stood at the apex of both state and church. This was centralization taken to its extreme. But power came at a cost. The empire's spiritual unity eroded. Regions resisted unevenly. Some complied out of fear, others out of conviction. Still others simply endured, waiting for the tide to turn. The longer iconoclasm lasted, the more it entrenched division. Ironically, external pressure did not abate during this internal struggle. Enemies continued to test the empire's borders. Armies still marched. Fortresses still fell and held. The empire fought on, even as it argued over the nature of the divine. Survival and belief advanced on parallel tracks, sometimes reinforcing one another, sometimes colliding. For the emperors who championed iconoclasm, success was measured in control, not consensus. They believed they were correcting error, restoring divine favor, and strengthening the empire through obedience. Every victory on the battlefield was taken as confirmation. Every defeat by icon supporters was dismissed as stubborn ignorance. Yet history rarely aligns so neatly with conviction. As years turned into decades, iconoclasm failed to produce the unity it promised. The empire survived, but not because belief had been purified. It survived because of discipline, geography, and hard-earned resilience. The link between icon destruction and divine favor remained unproven, even to those who enforced it. Meanwhile, the memory of loss endured. Icons destroyed were not forgotten. Stories circulated quietly. Theologians refined arguments in exile. Traditions persisted underground, waiting for space to re-emerge. Faith proved more adaptable than imperial decree. Byzantium had entered a prolonged civil struggle without armies, a war of symbols, meanings, and authority. And as the empire strained under the weight of enforced belief, a question grew ever louder, even if it was rarely spoken aloud. Could a sacred empire survive by coercing faith? Or had the pursuit of purity undermined the very unity it sought to protect? The answer would not come quickly. It would arrive only after generations of conflict, exhaustion, and reconsideration, when the empire finally turned back toward the traditions it had tried to erase. And when that reckoning came, it would redefine Byzantine identity once more. By the middle of the 9th century, the long war over icons reached its end, not with conquest, but with exhaustion. Generations had lived and died beneath shifting decrees, watching sacred images disappear and reappear, depending on the emperor's will. What iconoclasm promised in clarity, it delivered in division. What it sought in unity, it produced in fracture. The empire had endured, but it had learned. When imperial policy finally turned, it did so quietly, decisively, and with a sense of reckoning. Icons were restored to churches. Mosaics were repaired. Processions once suppressed returned to the streets of Constantinople. The empire did not frame this reversal as defeat, but as restoration, a return to proper order after prolonged trial. This moment became more than policy. It became memory. The restoration of icons was celebrated as the triumph of orthodoxy, but it also marked the limits of imperial power over belief. The emperor remained central to religious life, but the icon controversy had demonstrated that faith could not be reshaped indefinitely by decree. Tradition, theology, and popular devotion had proven resilient. From this struggle emerged a more clearly defined Byzantine identity. Icons were no longer merely devotional objects. They became symbols of endurance, evidence that faith, like the empire itself, could survive suppression and emerge transformed. The visual language of Byzantine Christianity grew richer, more formalized, and more symbolic, reflecting lessons learned through conflict. Art became theology. Images were governed by strict conventions, ensuring that representation remained faithful to doctrine. Creativity was channeled, not erased. The empire embraced a sacred aesthetic that emphasized transcendence over realism, meaning over imitation. This artistic discipline mirrored the empire's broader evolution, controlled, intentional, and deeply self-aware. Institutionally, the balance between throne and altar shifted. The emperor remained the defender of orthodoxy, but not its sole author. Church authority was clarified. Tradition gained weight alongside imperial will. Councils, not decrees alone, regained their role in defining belief. The sacred empire learned that stability required partnership, not domination. The trauma of iconoclasm left scars. Monasteries never fully recovered their former autonomy. Trust between church and state remained cautious, yet these wounds also fostered maturity. Byzantium emerged from the controversy with a sharper understanding of itself, what it could command and what it could not. Most importantly, the empire survived another internal crisis without disintegration. This resilience reinforced a central Byzantine conviction. Survival through struggle was not failure, it was refinement. Each crisis stripped away illusion and revealed what endured beneath pressure. As icons returned to walls and worship returned to rhythm, Byzantium entered a period of renewed confidence. The empire had not merely endured external threats, it had faced itself and emerged intact. This renewal would soon express itself beyond theology. Administrative stability returned. Military organization improved. Cultural life flourished. Learning revived. The empire once again looked outward, not in reckless ambition, but with cautious strength. The icon controversy had clarified the boundaries of belief and authority. It had reaffirmed the empire's identity as a sacred state, but one tempered by experience. Faith remained central, but no longer unquestioned. Power remained absolute, but no longer unchallenged. Byzantium stood at the threshold of revival. From the ashes of internal conflict emerged a civilization more disciplined, more defined, and more aware of its limits. It had learned that survival required not just strength, but balance. And as the 9th century unfolded, that balance would usher in one of the most remarkable periods of Byzantine history. A renaissance born not from conquest, but from consolidation. The empire, having reclaimed its identity, was ready to rise again. Chapter 7. The Macedonian Revival. In the quiet aftermath of Iconoclasm, Byzantium stood at an unexpected threshold. For nearly 2 centuries, the empire had lived in a state of permanent defense, its energies consumed by survival, its ambitions narrowed by loss. Yet by the late 9th century, something subtle but profound was changing. The storms had not vanished, but the empire had learned how to endure them, and endurance over time created space for renewal. From that space emerged a revival. The empire that entered this new era was no longer ancient Rome reborn, nor merely a fortress civilization clinging to life. It was a confident medieval state, disciplined, centralized, and self-aware. Its borders were more stable than they had been in generations. Its institutions functioned with hard-earned efficiency. Its identity, clarified through crisis, was now unmistakably Byzantine. At the heart of this transformation stood a new ruling house, the Macedonian dynasty. Its rise was neither glamorous nor inevitable. It emerged from the empire's provincial military elite, men shaped by frontier warfare, administrative pragmatism, and loyalty to the state, rather than aristocratic lineage. This background mattered. The emperors of this era did not rule from inherited prestige alone. They ruled through competence, continuity, and careful stewardship. The empire they governed was ready to grow again, but cautiously. Decades of reform had reshaped Byzantine society. Soldiers settled on land formed a stable defensive backbone. Local administration, though tightly supervised, allowed flexibility in response to threat. Taxation, once oppressive, became more systematic and predictable. The state did not extract recklessly, it managed. This was governance informed by memory. Constantinople reflected the change. The capital was no longer merely a refuge from catastrophe. It became a center of gravity once more, politically, culturally, and intellectually. Its streets bustled with artisans and traders. Its palaces hosted ceremonies that projected confidence rather than desperation. Its churches, newly restored and elaborately adorned, symbolized continuity restored after turmoil. The empire's relationship with faith matured. Orthodoxy, clarified through struggle, now served as a unifying force rather than a battlefield. Religious energy turned outward toward education, liturgy, and cultural expression rather than inward conflict. Monasteries recovered influence not as rivals to imperial power, but as partners in spiritual and social life. This balance strengthened the state. Beyond the capital, the empire's frontiers stabilized. In Anatolia, defenses held firm. In the Balkans, imperial authority slowly reasserted itself through diplomacy, settlement, and selective force. Slavic communities were integrated rather than simply resisted. Conversion, alliance, and administration replaced endless warfare. The empire had learned that control did not always require conquest. Meanwhile, to the east and south, old rivals remained. But the balance had shifted. Byzantium no longer fought from exhaustion alone. It negotiated from a position of resilience. Treaties bought time. Diplomacy exploited divisions among enemies. The empire used intelligence and patience as effectively as arms. This was a new kind of strength. Culturally, the revival ran deep. Classical learning, never fully lost, was actively cultivated again. Scholars copied ancient texts not as relics of a dead world, but as tools for understanding law, rhetoric, and governance. Education flourished among elites. Greek literature, philosophy, and history were studied with renewed purpose, shaping an intellectual tradition that would quietly influence the future of Europe. Art reflected confidence. Mosaics gleamed with renewed sophistication. Architecture emphasized harmony and symbolism. The visual language of Byzantium reached a mature form, controlled, transcendent, unmistakable. This was not experimentation. It was mastery. The empire, after centuries of contraction and crisis, had found its rhythm. Yet this revival was not naive. Byzantium did not forget the lessons of loss. Its expansion was measured, its reforms incremental, its ambitions disciplined by memory. The Macedonian emperors understood that greatness was no longer defined by universal dominion, but by stability, influence, and longevity. The empire had survived by narrowing its focus. Now it would rise by refining it. This period would come to be remembered as a golden age, not because Byzantium ruled the world, but because it understood itself. It balanced power and faith, tradition and adaptation, defense and culture. From the crucible of survival emerged a civilization at its most self-assured. And as the empire stepped forward with renewed confidence, history would once again test whether strength forged through endurance could sustain success. As the Macedonian dynasty consolidated its rule, renewal gave way to momentum. What had begun as internal stabilization now extended outward, carefully and deliberately. The empire did not surge forward blindly. It advanced with calculation, testing its strength, measuring its limits, and reclaiming influence step by step. Military confidence returned first. Reforms that had taken shape during centuries of survival now bore fruit. The Byzantine army was no longer a blunt instrument of massed conquest. It was a disciplined professional force designed for flexibility. Strategy emphasized intelligence, terrain, and timing. Diplomacy softened enemies before swords were drawn. When battles were fought, they were chosen with care. Along the eastern frontier, pressure eased. Byzantine forces reclaimed territory in Anatolia that had long been contested. Fortresses once isolated were reconnected into defensive networks. Roads were repaired, not to march endlessly outward, but to ensure rapid response and secure supply. The empire began to feel whole again. In the Balkans, imperial influence deepened. Rather than attempt outright domination, Byzantium pursued integration. Slavic and other communities were drawn into the imperial orbit through conversion, administration, and opportunity. Missionaries worked alongside officials. Christianity became a bridge rather than a weapon. Loyalty grew not only from fear, but from inclusion. This approach extended beyond borders. Byzantium projected power culturally as much as militarily. Its court became the model of civilization for neighboring states. Diplomacy was infused with ritual, symbolism, and spectacle. Foreign rulers were impressed, sometimes intimidated, by the grandeur of Constantinople, its ceremonies designed to communicate order, legitimacy, and permanence. The empire ruled as much through influence as force. This confidence found expression in law and learning. Legal traditions refined under earlier emperors were expanded and clarified. Administration became more consistent across regions. Officials were trained, monitored and rotated to prevent local entrenchment. The state functioned not as a collection of territories, but as a coherent system. Education flourished within this structure. Schools trained bureaucrats, clergy, and scholars in rhetoric, law, and theology. Ancient texts were preserved and studied with renewed energy. This was not antiquarianism, it was practical learning. Classical knowledge provided tools for governance, diplomacy, and moral reasoning. Byzantium did not idolize the past, it used it. The empire became a living archive. Art and architecture mirrored this maturity. Churches constructed in this period emphasized proportion, light, and symbolic clarity. Mosaics depicted sacred figures with solemn authority. Icons no longer contested, but codified. The visual culture of Byzantium reached a balance between transcendence and order, mirroring the state itself. Luxury crafts flourished: silk, metalwork, manuscript illumination, produced under imperial supervision and traded across borders. These objects carried Byzantine influence far beyond its frontiers, embedding its aesthetic and authority into the wider world. Faith, once a source of internal conflict, now unified. Orthodoxy provided common language across the empire. Liturgical practices standardized worship without erasing local tradition. Monasteries became centers of learning and charity, reinforcing social stability. The Church no longer challenged the state, it complemented it. This harmony strengthened imperial legitimacy. Emperors of the Macedonian line ruled not as distant autocrats, but as guardians of order, visible in law, ritual, and defense. Their authority felt earned rather than imposed. Stability bred loyalty. Loyalty bred confidence. Yet beneath this success lay an awareness born of history. The empire understood that revival could provoke resistance. Strength attracted rivals. Prosperity invited envy. Byzantium did not forget how quickly fortune could turn. Thus, expansion remained limited. Resources were conserved. Defense was never neglected. The empire was thriving, but it was not reckless. By the mid-10th century, Byzantium stood at its greatest height since Justinian, not in size alone, but in balance. It commanded respect abroad and coherence at home. Its culture was vibrant, its institutions reliable, its identity secure. This was a civilization comfortable with itself. Yet history rarely allows comfort to last. The very successes of the Macedonian revival would reshape the empire's elite, its military priorities, and its social balance. Prosperity would create new interests. Stability would breed complacency. And the careful equilibrium that sustained this golden age would begin to strain under the weight of its own achievement. The revival had restored Byzantium's strength. The question that remained was whether it could preserve that strength without losing the discipline that made it possible. By the close of the 10th century, the Byzantine Empire stood at a peak it had not known in generations. Its borders were secure, its armies victorious, its culture radiant with confidence. The long arc from survival to revival had reached fulfillment, and for a moment the empire seemed not merely resilient, but ascendant. This was Byzantium at its most self-possessed. Military success crowned the era. Imperial forces pushed outward with precision, reclaiming territories in the east and asserting dominance over long-standing rivals. Campaigns were no longer desperate defenses. They were controlled advances. Victories were consolidated, not squandered. The empire did not rush forward blindly. It absorbed gains with administrative care. Yet conquest was only one dimension of strength. At home, governance functioned with remarkable cohesion. The bureaucracy, refined over centuries, operated with consistency. Taxes were collected, roads maintained, justice administered. The empire felt ordered, not imposed, but structured. This predictability, rare in the medieval world, underpinned every other achievement. Constantinople embodied the age. The capital thrived as a metropolis of trade, learning, and ceremony. Its harbors drew merchants from across continents. Its palaces staged rituals designed to awe visitors and reaffirm internal hierarchy. To foreign envoys, the city appeared eternal, untouched by the volatility that defined their own realms. Culture flourished under this stability. Literature revisited classical forms with renewed sophistication. History was written not as lament, but as analysis. Scholars copied and commented on ancient texts, preserving knowledge that would one day ignite intellectual renewal beyond Byzantium's borders. Art reached a refined maturity. Icons no longer contested but revered as essential expressions of belief and identity. Faith, at last, was at peace with power. Orthodoxy unified the empire spiritually without consuming it in conflict. The Church reinforced imperial authority through ritual and moral guidance, while the state protected the Church's place in society. The long trauma of iconoclasm had clarified boundaries. Balance replaced domination. Yet even at this height, signs of strain emerged. Success reshaped the empire's social fabric. Wealth accumulated in the hands of elites. Large landowners expanded influence, threatening the balance between state and local power. The military, increasingly professionalized, grew more detached from the agrarian base that had once sustained it. These shifts were subtle, but consequential. The empire's strength depended on equilibrium between center and province, soldier and farmer, tradition and reform. Prosperity altered those relationships. The system that had thrived under pressure now faced a different challenge: how to adapt to abundance. Externally, the world did not remain still. New powers watched Byzantium's revival closely. Western Europe was reorganizing under emerging monarchies. Trade routes shifted, alliances evolved. The empire's influence remained formidable, but no longer uncontested. Internally, memory faded. The generations that had known survival through catastrophe were passing. In their place rose elites shaped by stability, not crisis. Discipline softened, caution dulled. The lessons learned through plague, loss, and contraction grew abstract. This was the paradox of success. Byzantium had mastered survival. It had reclaimed strength, but in doing so, it risked forgetting the very adaptability that had preserved it. Still, the Macedonian age left an indelible mark. It proved that Byzantium was not merely a relic of Rome, nor a state frozen by fear. It was capable of renewal, intellectual, cultural, and military. It demonstrated that balance, not dominance, defined lasting power. As the 11th century approached, the empire stood poised between continuity and change. The foundations were strong, the culture vibrant, the memory of survival still present, if fading. What remained uncertain was whether Byzantium could adjust once more when the conditions that sustained its golden age began to shift. History had granted the empire a reprieve. Whether it could turn reprieve into permanence would define the next chapter of its long journey. Chapter 8. Fractures with the West. At the height of its confidence, Byzantium looked westward and saw not reflection, but distance. The Roman world, once unified by law, language, and imperial authority, had been divided for centuries. Yet only now did the separation become unmistakable. What had once been a shared civilization was hardening into two distinct worlds, each shaped by different histories, priorities, and beliefs. The fracture did not begin with hostility. For generations after the fall of the Western Roman Empire, Constantinople had considered the Latin West a fractured limb of the same body, damaged perhaps, but still Roman in essence. Western kings ruled former imperial lands using Roman titles. Church leaders looked to the legacy of Rome for authority. The idea of unity lingered even when reality contradicted it. But time reshapes memory. In the West, new political orders emerged. Kingdoms built on feudal bonds rather than imperial bureaucracy. Power became personal, localized, negotiated through loyalty and land. In the East, power remained institutional, centralized, and ceremonial. The emperor ruled through systems refined over centuries. What Byzantium valued as order, the West increasingly viewed as distant and alien. Language widened the gap. Greek dominated the Eastern Empire, shaping theology, philosophy, and administration. Latin, once the empire's legal backbone, faded in the East. In the West, Latin evolved into the language of the church and scholarship, even as spoken tongues fractured into new vernaculars. Communication across the old imperial divide grew strained, imprecise, and increasingly symbolic. Faith, once a unifying force, followed separate paths. Both East and West were Christian, but they practiced Christianity differently. The Eastern Church emphasized theology, liturgy, and continuity with ancient tradition. The Western Church, shaped by political fragmentation, emphasized authority, discipline, and legal clarity. Neither path was inherently hostile, but each came to see the other as incomplete or misguided. At the center of Western Christianity stood Rome. The Bishop of Rome claimed spiritual primacy, rooted in apostolic tradition and the memory of imperial capital. In the East, this claim was acknowledged, but cautiously. The Byzantine worldview accepted honor, not supremacy. Authority was shared among ancient centers of Christianity, coordinated through councils rather than command. This difference was subtle, but explosive. In Constantinople, the emperor remained the protector of the church, shaping its public role and defending orthodoxy. In the West, the absence of a strong emperor elevated the pope into a unique position, spiritual leader and political arbiter. Over time, this distinction hardened into rivalry. Customs diverged. Rituals differed. Clerical practices varied. Even the calendar reflected different rhythms of worship. These were not initially seen as schisms, but as regional expressions within a shared faith. Yet as communication weakened, misunderstanding deepened. Each side began to define itself in contrast to the other. Byzantines viewed Western practices as crude, legally rigid, and theologically imprecise. Western observers saw the East as overly ceremonial, philosophically abstract, and politically domineering. Mutual caricature replaced familiarity. Still, unity endured, barely. Envoys traveled, letters were exchanged. The shared memory of Rome lingered as a fragile bridge. But the world that sustained that bridge was fading. The West was reawakening in its own way, no longer looking east for guidance. The East, confident in its revival, felt less need to accommodate difference. This was not a sudden break. It was erosion. The fracture between East and West formed slowly, through centuries of divergence rather than a single moment of betrayal. Yet by the 11th century, the conditions were set. Identity had hardened. Authority was contested. Tradition was interpreted through different lenses. When conflict finally surfaced openly, it would not feel new. It would feel inevitable. The Roman world had split long ago in administration and culture. Now it was approaching a rupture of belief, one that would reshape Christianity and geopolitics alike. And in that rupture, Byzantium would discover that survival within one world did not guarantee understanding across another. As the 11th century unfolded, the distance between East and West was no longer merely cultural, it was institutional. What had once been differences of custom and emphasis now hardened into disputes over authority itself. At stake was not a single doctrine or ritual, but the question of who spoke for Christendom. In the West, the Church was changing. Freed from imperial oversight after Rome's political collapse, the papacy had grown into a formidable institution. Popes asserted moral authority over kings, claimed universal jurisdiction, and worked to standardize belief and practice across Western Europe. Reform movements sought discipline, hierarchy, and clarity. The Church of the West was becoming centralized, legalistic, and confident in its claim to lead all Christians. In the East, this confidence was unsettling. Byzantium had never accepted a single earthly authority over the Church. Orthodoxy was defined through councils, not commands. Honor was given to Rome, but not obedience. To the Byzantine mind, unity required balance among ancient centers of faith, safeguarded by the emperor as protector, not subordinated to one bishop. These views were not easily reconciled. Each side believed it preserved the true legacy of Rome. Each viewed the other as drifting from proper order. And as dialogue became more strained, pride replaced patience. Disputes multiplied. Theological language became sharper. Differences in liturgical practice, once tolerated, were reframed as errors. Even minor variations were weaponized in arguments over legitimacy. What had been diversity within unity became evidence of deviation. Byzantium, confident in its intellectual tradition, often dismissed Western theology as crude or unsophisticated. Western churchmen, in turn, accused the East of arrogance and resistance to reform. Mutual respect eroded under the weight of centuries-old grievances. Politics worsened matters. The Byzantine Empire, though revived, faced pressures on multiple fronts. Western powers, newly energized and increasingly ambitious, no longer viewed Constantinople as the unquestioned center of Christendom. They sought autonomy, influence, and recognition on their own terms. The papacy, in particular, saw opportunity. By asserting authority over the Eastern Church, it could solidify its claim to universal leadership. For Byzantium, such a claim was intolerable, not only as a theological overreach, but as a political threat. To accept papal supremacy would be to undermine imperial sovereignty itself. Thus, theology and geopolitics became inseparable. Diplomatic missions attempted compromise. Letters were exchanged, heavy with ceremony and suspicion. Each side spoke past the other, convinced of its own legitimacy. Trust, already thin, vanished. Then came confrontation. When representatives of the Western Church arrived in Constantinople with demands rather than dialogue, the fragile balance collapsed. Accusations were laid bare. Authority was challenged publicly. Ritual gestures meant to assert dominance replaced negotiation. The rupture was formal, but its roots were ancient. Mutual condemnations were issued, sealing a division that had been forming for centuries. What had once been one Christian world now stood divided, not by armies, but by identity. For Byzantium, the break was traumatic, but not entirely unexpected. The empire saw itself as the true continuation of Roman and Christian order. To be rejected, or to reject the West, felt less like abandonment than clarification. Byzantium would preserve orthodoxy as it understood it, even if that meant standing alone. Yet the cost was real. The fracture weakened Christendom at a moment when unity mattered. It hardened mistrust. It closed avenues of cooperation, and it ensured that future encounters between East and West would be shaped not by shared faith, but by rivalry and suspicion. The Roman world had split one final time, not into empires, but into civilizations. And as Byzantium turned inward to guard its identity, it could not yet foresee how devastating this division would become when crisis demanded unity rather than pride. Because beyond doctrine and ceremony, a greater test loomed, one that would bring East and West together again, not as brothers, but as uneasy allies with incompatible visions. And when that moment arrived, the fracture now sealed would shape events in ways no council or decree could undo. When the fracture between East and West became final, it did not unfold with thunder or immediate war. There were no armies mobilized, no cities burned in its name. Instead, the separation settled slowly, like a fault line beneath the surface of history, silent, deep, and irreversible. For Byzantium, the break marked a turning inward. The empire did not see itself as isolated. It saw itself as purified. In the Byzantine worldview, orthodoxy had been preserved against innovation, tradition defended against overreach. The emperor remained the guardian of the true faith, the protector of a Christian order rooted in continuity rather than command. To lose communion with the West was regrettable, but preferable to surrendering balance and sovereignty. Yet even as Byzantium framed the rupture as clarification, its consequences unfolded relentlessly. Diplomatic language changed. Western rulers no longer approached Constantinople as the unquestioned senior partner of Christendom. They arrived as equals or rivals. The cultural awe that once accompanied encounters with Byzantine ceremony faded, replaced by skepticism and ambition. The empire's influence remained immense, but it was no longer universally acknowledged. Trade continued, but trust thinned. Pilgrims still traveled east, merchants still crossed borders, scholars still exchanged ideas. But beneath these interactions lay suspicion. Shared faith no longer guaranteed shared purpose. Every encounter was filtered through memory of rejection and pride. This subtle shift would prove catastrophic in time. Byzantium had survived centuries of pressure by relying on a powerful assumption that Christian unity, however strained, would ultimately prevail in moments of existential danger. That assumption was now broken. The empire stood alone as the eastern pillar of a divided world. The West, meanwhile, was changing rapidly. New kingdoms consolidated power. Military culture intensified. Religious zeal fused with political ambition. Western Christianity grew increasingly militant, its leaders accustomed to asserting authority through force as much as decree. The papacy, having secured its supremacy in the West, looked outward with renewed confidence. Byzantium watched these developments with unease. To the empire's leaders, the West appeared volatile, less refined, more aggressive, driven by conviction untempered by experience. To the West, Byzantium appeared distant, aloof, and obstructive, an ancient power unwilling to submit or adapt. These perceptions hardened into stereotypes. What had once been misunderstandings became justifications. The irony was devastating. At the very moment the Christian world fractured along lines of authority and identity, the empire faced mounting pressure from beyond Christendom. New powers surrounded Byzantium, dynamic, expanding, and unconcerned with theological nuance. The empire needed allies who understood its strategic position, its vulnerabilities, and its value as a bulwark. Instead, it faced a West increasingly indifferent to its survival. The division reshaped Byzantine strategy. Cut off from reliable cooperation, the empire doubled down on diplomacy, intelligence, and internal cohesion. It refined its art of survival once more, relying on negotiation and calculated compromise where unity might once have sufficed. The empire endured, but the margin for error narrowed. Psychologically, the rupture left a scar. Byzantines began to see themselves as a chosen remnant, guardians of true faith in a world drifting from order. This reinforced cultural confidence, but also isolation. Openness gave way to defensiveness. Pride replaced curiosity. The empire's remarkable adaptability persisted, but its willingness to trust diminished. This inward turn preserved identity, but at a price. When future crises demanded collaboration across civilizations, the memory of division would poison attempts at cooperation. Appeals for aid would be met with conditions. Alliances would come wrapped in suspicion. Faith would no longer guarantee solidarity. The fracture between East and West was not merely religious. It was civilizational. It shaped how each side understood power, legitimacy, and purpose. It redefined the map of medieval politics, and it ensured that when East and West met again in moments of crisis, they would do so not as heirs of a shared world, but as strangers bound by convenience. Byzantium had survived external threats by mastering adaptation. Now it faced a subtler danger. Isolation born not of weakness, but of division. The empire remained strong, cultured, and resilient, but it stood increasingly alone, its fate tied to its own resources, its own judgment, its own endurance. And in the centuries ahead, that isolation would prove far more dangerous than any single enemy. Because when the West finally returned to the East in force, it would not come as a protector of Rome's legacy, but as a power shaped by a different vision of faith, authority, and destiny. Chapter 9. Crusaders and Catastrophe. At the close of the 11th century, Byzantium faced a crisis unlike any it had known before, not because it stood alone, but because help finally arrived from the West. Yet this help came shaped by a world that no longer understood the empire it claimed to defend. The enemies pressing against Byzantium's eastern frontiers were relentless. Anatolia, the empire's military heartland, had been fractured by decades of warfare. Fortresses that once anchored imperial defense lay isolated. Roads fell into hostile hands. The empire still endured, but its margin for survival narrowed with each passing year. From Constantinople, the emperor looked westward, not with confidence, but necessity. The appeal was unprecedented. For the first time in centuries, the Eastern Roman Empire openly requested military assistance from Latin Christendom. This was not an act of submission, but desperation tempered by calculation. Byzantine leaders believed they could manage Western aid as they had managed mercenaries and allies before, through diplomacy, contracts, and imperial authority. They underestimated how much the West had changed. In Western Europe, a new religious fervor had taken hold, one forged by reform, ambition, and the promise of redemption through action. Faith was no longer confined to monasteries or pulpits. It marched, it armed itself, it promised salvation not through endurance, but through conquest. When the call went out, it did not summon disciplined contingents under imperial command. It unleashed a movement. From across Europe, armies gathered. Knights, nobles, peasants, zealots, bound by oath, symbol, and expectation. They marched not as auxiliaries of the Roman emperor, but as warriors of God, convinced their mission transcended imperial borders. To Byzantium, this was alarming. The empire understood war as administration by other means, controlled, negotiated, limited. The crusading armies brought with them a different logic. They saw the East not as a sophisticated civilization to be preserved, but as terrain to be liberated, claimed, or judged. Still, Constantinople opened its gates. Western armies arrived in waves, overwhelming the city with numbers and unpredictability. They camped outside its walls, astonished by its scale, wealth, and ritual. To many crusaders, Constantinople appeared alien, Christian, yet unfamiliar, Roman, yet strange, awe mingled with suspicion. The empire moved quickly to assert control. Crusader leaders were required to swear oaths, pledging to return conquered lands to imperial authority. Agreements were negotiated, supplies provided, transport arranged. Byzantium sought to channel crusading zeal into a form it could manage. On parchment, the system held. In practice, it strained immediately. The Crusaders did not fully trust the empire. They questioned its faith, its motives, its legitimacy. Byzantine officials, in turn, doubted the discipline and intentions of the Western armies. Communication faltered. Cultural assumptions clashed. Each side interpreted cooperation through its own worldview. Yet necessity overrode suspicion. The Crusaders moved eastward. Battles were fought. Cities fell. For a brief moment, it appeared that collaboration, however uneasy, might succeed. The empire watched as territories long lost were wrested from its enemies. But something fundamental had shifted. The Crusaders did not see themselves as restoring imperial order. They saw themselves as founders of a new one. Lands conquered were not simply handed back. They were claimed, governed, and defended by Western rulers who owed Byzantium little more than memory. What Byzantium intended as recovery became displacement. Still, the empire endured the arrangement. Pragmatism overrode pride. So long as pressure eased on its borders, compromise seemed worthwhile. The capital remained safe. Trade continued. Diplomacy persisted. Yet beneath the surface, resentment grew. Western armies moved through Byzantine lands with disregard for local authority. Discipline frayed. Supplies were seized. Cities were strained. The empire began to sense that it had invited not allies, but a force it could neither fully control nor easily expel. The fracture between East and West, once theological and cultural, was now embodied in armed men. The Crusaders were not simply passing through Byzantium. They were learning it, measuring it, and quietly judging it. The empire had survived invasions before by adapting to familiar enemies. This time the danger lay not in opposition but in alliance shaped by misunderstanding. By calling the West eastward, Byzantium had opened a door it could not easily close. And history was already moving toward a reckoning that would test whether shared faith could restrain ambition, or whether catastrophe would follow where cooperation failed. The uneasy partnership between Byzantium and the crusading armies rested on a fragile illusion that shared faith would restrain competing ambitions. For a time, that illusion held. Victories against common enemies brought relief to imperial frontiers. Supply lines reopened. The capital breathed easier. Yet every success carried within it the seed of rupture. Because the two sides were fighting different wars. For Byzantium, war was instrumental, measured by territory stabilized. borders secured, threats delayed. For the Crusaders, war was redemptive, measured by sacrifice, conquest, and divine favor. Victory did not conclude obligation. It validated entitlement. What Byzantium regarded as temporary expedience, the Crusaders understood as permanent claim. As Western leaders established themselves in conquered lands, their loyalties shifted. Oaths sworn in Constantinople faded against realities on the ground. New principalities emerged, ruled by men who answered not to the emperor, but to their own ambitions and to the spiritual authority of the West. Byzantine officials watched as former imperial cities were governed without reference to imperial law or custom. The empire protested. Negotiations followed. Agreements were invoked. But power had already changed hands. Trust deteriorated rapidly. Byzantine commanders grew cautious, withholding support. Crusader leaders accused the empire of duplicity and weakness. Each side believed the other ungrateful. Each interpreted compromise as betrayal. The atmosphere darkened. Western chroniclers painted Byzantines as deceitful, effeminate, and corrupt, Christians in name only. Byzantine observers, in turn, described Crusaders as violent, undisciplined, and driven by greed, masked as piety. Mutual suspicion hardened into open contempt. Still, catastrophe was not yet inevitable. Trade continued between Constantinople and Western-controlled territories. Pilgrimage routes functioned. Diplomacy endured. The empire, experienced in managing unreliable partners, attempted to contain the damage. It relied on its walls, its wealth, and its patience. But the West was changing. Crusading ideology evolved from expedition into institution. Military orders formed, professional, permanent, and fiercely loyal to their own hierarchies. Western powers learned the geography, politics, and vulnerabilities of the Eastern Mediterranean. Knowledge once monopolized by Byzantium spread rapidly among its uneasy allies. The empire was being studied by those who would one day exploit it. Economic tension compounded mistrust. Western merchants gained increasing privileges within Byzantine cities, access to ports, exemptions from taxes, control over trade routes. These concessions, granted in moments of weakness, reshaped the empire's economy. Local merchants were displaced. Wealth flowed outward. Resentment simmered among the population. Constantinople felt the strain. The capital, long accustomed to viewing itself as the center of civilization, now hosted growing Western enclaves whose customs, language, and loyalties set them apart. Cultural friction became daily reality. Fights broke out. Insults multiplied. The city's unity, its greatest strength, was quietly undermined. Yet the empire endured. It had weathered worse: plague, conquest, civil war. Compared to these, tension with allies seemed manageable. Imperial strategy focused on long-term survival rather than immediate confrontation. This restraint would later be mistaken for weakness. As decades passed, the gap between East and West widened further. Crusading states entrenched themselves. Western leaders grew bolder. The papacy's influence expanded. The idea that Byzantium was merely another prize, wealthy, decadent, and vulnerable, began to circulate openly. The empire's enemies no longer stood only beyond its borders. They camped nearby, traded within its markets, worshipped beside its churches, yet imagined its downfall. Byzantium sensed the danger, but lacked the strength to expel it. To do so would risk open war with the West, a conflict the empire could not afford. Diplomacy once again became the empire's shield. But diplomacy requires good faith. As the 12th century approached, that faith eroded rapidly. The empire that had survived by adaptation, now faced a peril Adaptation could not easily solve: how to defend itself from allies who no longer believed in its legitimacy. The seeds of catastrophe were sown not in battle, but in resentment. And when opportunity presented itself, when politics, ambition, and chance aligned, the fragile alliance would collapse in spectacular violence. What followed would not be an accident of war. It would be the consequence of division long ignored, mistrust long nurtured, and ambition finally unleashed. The catastrophe did not arrive as destiny. It arrived as choice. By the early 13th century, the relationship between Byzantium and the Latin West had decayed beyond repair. Decades of mistrust, economic rivalry, cultural contempt, and religious division had transformed uneasy cooperation into open hostility. The empire still stood, wealthy in appearance, proud in memory, but its foundations were fragile, undermined by internal instability and external greed. The moment came when politics aligned with opportunity. A new crusading army gathered in the West, its declared purpose distant and holy. Yet from the outset, its course bent toward convenience rather than conviction. Financial strain, manipulation, and ambition redirected its path eastward toward the richest city Christendom had ever known: Constantinople. To the Crusaders, the city was no longer the sacred heir of Rome. It was a prize, a place of unimaginable wealth, guarded by walls that had never fallen, ruled by an empire they neither trusted nor respected. Old grievances resurfaced, the language of betrayal returned. Faith was invoked, but selectively. The empire, weakened by internal division, was unprepared for the scale of the threat. Political instability had hollowed authority. Rival claimants contested the throne, loyalties fractured. The population, long strained by concessions to Western powers, watched in dread as foreign armies gathered before their walls, not as allies, but as conquerors. When the attack came, it stunned the world. For the first time in its history, Constantinople was breached by a Christian army. Churches were looted. Sacred relics were stolen or destroyed. Palaces were ransacked. Artifacts preserved for centuries vanished in days. Violence swept through streets once defined by ritual and order. The seat that had survived siege after siege fell not to external enemies, but to those who claimed to fight in the name of the same God. This was not conquest alone. It was desecration. The sack of Constantinople shattered Byzantium's sense of invincibility. The empire did not simply lose its capital, it lost its center of gravity. Authority collapsed. Institutions fractured. What remained of imperial power scattered into exile, clinging to fragments of legitimacy in distant territories. The psychological damage was incalculable. The sacred empire, long convinced of divine protection, confronted a truth it could not reconcile. Faith had not saved it. Unity had not restrained violence. Shared belief had not prevented betrayal. The Roman world had been broken by Christians. In the aftermath, a shadow of empire lingered. Byzantine successors ruled from scattered centers, preserving memory, law, and hope. But the unity that had defined Byzantium for nearly a millennium was gone. The empire would return, but diminished, wounded, and permanently altered. The West moved on. Crusaders established their rule amid ruins. Wealth flowed westward. Relics that once adorned Constantinople appeared in foreign churches, stripped of context and meaning. The balance of power in the Mediterranean shifted irrevocably. For Byzantium, survival resumed, but without illusion. The empire that re-emerged would never again command the authority, wealth, or confidence it once possessed. Its role shifted from central power to endangered heir, from guardian of civilization to keeper of memory. Yet even in ruin, Byzantium endured. Its scholars preserved knowledge. Its faith sustained identity. Its language carried its history forward. The empire lived on, not in dominance, but in defiance of erasure. The catastrophe of betrayal redefined Byzantium's destiny. From this moment onward, survival would be an act of resistance rather than expectation. Every generation would rule knowing that the greatest danger did not always come from the outside, but from those who claimed to stand beside them. And as the empire struggled to recover from the deepest wound in its history, a new world was already forming around it, one in which Byzantium would no longer shape events but struggle simply to remain alive. The sack of Constantinople was not the end, but it ensured that the end, when it came, would be irreversible. Chapter 10. A Broken Restoration. In the aftermath of catastrophe, Byzantium did not vanish. It fragmented. When Constantinople fell to foreign hands, the idea of empire survived only in memory and exile. The sacred capital lay wounded, its treasures scattered, its institutions dismantled, its authority mocked by those who ruled in its ruins. Yet beyond the broken walls, Roman identity endured, carried by officials, clergy, soldiers, and scholars, who refused to accept that 1,000 years of continuity had ended in a single season of betrayal. From the wreckage emerged rival claimants to legitimacy. Imperial authority reconstituted itself in scattered territories, far from the Bosporus, far from the city that had once anchored the world. Courts in exile arose in lands still free of foreign rule, each claiming to be the true continuation of the Roman state. These were not rebellions. They were acts of preservation. The empire, reduced to fragments, struggled to remember itself. Administrations rebuilt with what remained: copies of law codes, remnants of ceremonial tradition, titles stripped of their former weight, yet still spoken with reverence. Emperors ruled without their capital. Patriarchs presided without their churches. What had once been absolute now survived through insistence. This was restoration without restoration. The loss of Constantinople was more than political, it was cosmological. For centuries, the city had been the axis of Byzantine existence, the meeting point of heaven and earth, empire and faith. Its fall ruptured the spiritual geography of the Roman world. Sacred processions ceased. Ritual hierarchy collapsed. The empire's belief in its own permanence shattered. Yet the idea of Rome refused to die. In exile, Byzantines became custodians of memory. Scholars carried manuscripts west and east, preserving classical texts that had survived fire, plague, and war. Clergy preserved liturgy and doctrine, even as sacred spaces lay defiled. Soldiers clung to discipline and tradition, defending borders that no longer felt like frontiers, but last stands. The empire no longer governed a world. It governed hope. Surrounded by hostile powers and rival Christian states, the Byzantine successors faced a cruel paradox. To reclaim Constantinople was to restore legitimacy, but to attempt it risked annihilation. Resources were scarce, armies were thin, allies were unreliable. Diplomacy replaced dominance as the empire's primary weapon. Negotiation became survival. Treaties were signed with former enemies. Concessions were made where once commands were issued. The empire learned to speak softly, not because it wished to, but because it had no choice. Its authority depended less on force than on endurance and recognition. Meanwhile, the occupiers of Constantinople struggled to rule what they had seized. They inherited a city too complex, too ceremonial, too deeply Roman to be easily transformed. Administration faltered. Resources dwindled. The population resisted quietly. The capital's greatness, stripped of its institutions, became a burden rather than a prize. The city longed for its past, even as it was forced into an alien future. Across the fragmented Roman world, a single question haunted every court and monastery. Could Byzantium be restored? The answer was uncertain. Time worked against the empire. Each passing year normalized loss. Children grew up without memory of imperial Constantinople. Traditions weakened. The idea of restoration, once urgent, risked becoming symbolic rather than real. Yet within this decline burned a quiet determination. The empire had survived worse. It had endured exile before, in memory, if not in geography. Rome had fallen in the west, yet lived on in the east. Now the east had fallen, and Rome lived on in fragments. History had reversed, but not erased, the pattern. This was Byzantium, at its most vulnerable, stripped of its center, dependent on endurance alone. Yet it was also Byzantium, at its most defiant. It refused to concede legitimacy to conquerors. It refused to surrender memory. It refused to accept that continuity could be ended by violence. The restoration that followed would not be glorious. It would be incomplete, fragile, and haunted by loss. But it would happen, because Byzantium did not survive by reclaiming what was lost. It survived by refusing to forget who it was. And in that refusal, the foundations of a broken restoration were quietly laid. When Constantinople was finally reclaimed, it did not feel like triumph. The banners that rose once more above the city's walls carried ancient symbols, but the world beneath them had changed beyond recognition. The return of Byzantine rule was real, lawfully proclaimed, ritually affirmed, but it was also painfully incomplete. What had been restored was sovereignty, not strength. The empire came home to ruins. Constantinople, once the beating heart of a world empire, was hollowed out. Entire districts lay abandoned. Palaces stood stripped of ornament. Churches bore scars that could not be repaired by ritual alone. The population had shrunk dramatically, and those who remained lived among memories rather than abundance. The city still inspired awe, but it no longer commanded it. Administratively, the empire reassembled what it could. Courts reopened. Offices were refilled. Ceremonies resumed with deliberate precision, as if repetition itself might summon the past back into being. Titles were spoken with the same gravity they once carried, even when the power behind them was diminished. Continuity was performed into existence. Yet beyond the walls, the empire's position was precarious. Territories were few, fragmented, and vulnerable. Resources were scarce. Armies were small and often reliant on mercenaries, whose loyalty was tied to payment rather than identity. The empire could no longer impose its will. It could only negotiate its survival. Diplomacy became the primary instrument of statecraft. Byzantium balanced rivals against one another. Latin powers, Balkan states, rising forces from Anatolia, playing a dangerous game where a single miscalculation could prove fatal. Treaties were signed not for advantage, but for time. Marriages replaced campaigns. Tribute replaced command. The empire survived by buying moments. Internally, society adapted to diminished horizons. The aristocracy, once shaped by service to a powerful state, now operated within a narrower sphere. Wealth concentrated in fewer hands. Local power grew at the expense of central authority. The emperor remained sacred, but increasingly dependent on cooperation rather than obedience. The church, too, adjusted. Faith remained central to Byzantine identity, but its tone shifted. Gone was the confidence of universal guardianship. In its place emerged a quieter, more introspective spirituality, one shaped by loss, endurance, and expectation of hardship. The empire saw itself less as the ruler of the world and more as its final witness. This humility was sincere, but also dangerous. Without the means to enforce unity, the state relied heavily on symbolism and tradition. The past became both refuge and burden. Byzantium defined itself by what it had been, even as it struggled to function in what it had become. The restored empire lived in the shadow of its own history. Every ceremony evoked comparison. Every success felt provisional. Every setback threatened final collapse. The city that had once stood unchallenged now existed at the mercy of forces it could no longer fully resist. Yet even so, Byzantium endured. It endured because its institutions, though weakened, still existed, because its people still believed in Roman continuity, because memory itself became a form of power, shaping identity when material strength failed. The empire was no longer expanding, but it was not yet finished. Constantinople remained a center of learning and diplomacy. Scholars preserved texts that would shape future civilizations. Artists continued to produce works of haunting beauty. The empire's influence, though indirect, extended beyond its borders through culture rather than command. This was survival in its final form, not resilience through adaptation, not revival through reform, but persistence through meaning. The Restoration had saved the empire from immediate extinction, but it could not restore what had been lost. Byzantium lived on, but it did so knowing that every year survived was borrowed time. And beyond its walls, the world was shifting once more. New powers gathered strength. New technologies altered warfare. Old buffers disappeared. The fragile equilibrium that sustained the restored empire grew thinner with each passing decade. The question was no longer whether Byzantium could reclaim greatness. It was whether it could endure the end. And as the empire balanced between memory and mortality, history prepared to close the long arc it had spared for more than 1,000 years. The restored Byzantine Empire did not collapse under the weight of defeat. It thinned. What survived after the return to Constantinople was not an empire in the classical sense, but a state sustained by memory, ritual, and extraordinary persistence. Its borders were fragile, its revenues uncertain, its armies small and increasingly obsolete, yet its identity, refined over centuries of crisis, remained intact. This was Byzantium in its final condition. The emperors who ruled from the reclaimed capital understood the truth their predecessors could not ignore. There would be no second restoration, no revival like that of Justinian, no golden age like the Macedonian era. The empire's task was no longer to reclaim the world, but to outlast it. Policy reflected this realism. Foreign relations dominated imperial attention. The court became a theater of diplomacy where envoys from rival powers were received with meticulous ceremony. Every gesture, every title, every protocol was designed to project continuity and legitimacy far beyond what military strength could enforce. Byzantium ruled through symbolism as much as strategy. Marriage alliances became weapons. Tribute became defense. Delay became survival. Within the city, life adjusted to reduced horizons. Constantinople remained magnificent in outline, its walls still formidable, its skyline still crowned by ancient domes. But much of its interior lay quiet. Empty spaces testified to a population that would never fully return. The capital endured not as a bustling metropolis, but as a monumental memory of what empire had once been. Yet this quiet was not emptiness. Within monasteries and schools, scholars continued their work. Manuscripts were copied, classical texts preserved, theology refined. Byzantine intellectual life, no longer tied to power, turned toward legacy. Knowledge was safeguarded not for conquest, but for transmission. In this role, Byzantium became indispensable. As Western Europe slowly emerged from fragmentation, it looked eastward, not for authority, but for wisdom. Ancient Greek thought, preserved and interpreted by Byzantine scholars, filtered west through translation and contact. Rome's legacy survived not through armies, but through books. The empire's influence outlived its strength. But influence could not stop encroachment. Beyond Constantinople's walls, new forces pressed closer each year. The balance that had sustained the restored empire was eroding. Old rivals disappeared, replaced by a power younger, more unified, and increasingly confident. Territory shrank, resources dwindled, the empire's room to maneuver narrowed. Still, Byzantium did not surrender. The city's defenses were repaired again and again. Emperors appealed for aid where they could, sometimes to the West that had once betrayed them. Conditions were debated. Concessions weighed against survival. Pride battled necessity. Faith, once triumphant, now carried undertones of resignation. The empire did not expect rescue. It expected trial. Its theology reflected this shift, focused on endurance, repentance, and the hope of meaning beyond history. Byzantium no longer believed itself destined to rule the world. It believed itself chosen to witness its passing. This belief gave strength where resources could not. As decades passed, the empire's survival became increasingly improbable. Yet improbability had never stopped Byzantium before. Time and again, it had defied prediction. It had endured invasions, schisms, plagues, betrayals, and collapse. Now, it endured decline. The restored empire was not a failure. It was a final act of continuity, a refusal to allow history to erase a civilization that had carried Rome, Christianity, and classical learning across a millennium of upheaval. Every year it survived was a statement that memory, discipline, and identity could outlast power. But history is relentless. The forces gathering beyond the Bosporus were no longer temporary. They represented a new era, one Byzantium could not shape, only resist. The empire sensed this. Its rulers knew that survival now meant delay, not victory. And yet, delay mattered. Each decade preserved meant knowledge transmitted. Each year endured meant legacy secured. Byzantium's final gift to history would not be conquest, but continuity long enough for others to inherit what it had safeguarded. As the 14th century deepened, the empire stood at the edge of finality. Still standing, still Roman, still refusing to disappear. But the walls that had held for 1,000 years were aging, the world beyond them had changed irreversibly, and the final chapter of Byzantium's story, long postponed by resilience, was drawing near. The restoration had been broken, but it had bought time. And in that time, Byzantium ensured that when it finally fell, it would not fall forgotten. Chapter 11. The Last Siege. In the final decades of Byzantium's long life, Constantinople existed in a state of suspended inevitability. The city still stood, its walls unbroken, its churches echoing with prayer, its imperial rituals performed with ancient precision. But everyone within them understood the truth the empire had delayed for generations. Time was running out. The world beyond the Bosporus had changed irrevocably. The balance of power that once allowed Byzantium to survive through diplomacy and delay had collapsed. The empire's remaining territories were little more than fragments clustered around the capital. Its population was diminished, its treasury thin, its allies uncertain or indifferent. Yet Constantinople endured, not because it was strong, but because it was Constantinople. Its walls, layered and reinforced across centuries, remain the greatest defensive system the medieval world had ever known. They had turned back Persians, Arabs, Bulgars, and countless others. They stood as monuments to survival itself, stone expressions of an empire's refusal to end. Inside those walls lived a people shaped by memory. They walked streets once crowded with imperial processions and foreign envoys. They worshipped in churches whose mosaics reflected a glory no longer matched by power. They spoke of Rome not as a dream, but as identity. Even now they called themselves Romans, not out of denial, but defiance. The empire was small, but it was still an empire in spirit. At its head stood an emperor who understood the stakes with painful clarity. He ruled not with illusions of rescue, but with acceptance of responsibility. There would be no vast reinforcements from the West, no sudden reversal of fortune. Whatever happened next would be decided here, beneath these walls, by those who remained. Beyond the city, a new power gathered with relentless focus. This rival did not inherit the ancient world. It replaced it. It was young, dynamic, and disciplined, forged by expansion and confidence rather than memory and restraint. Its leaders studied Constantinople not as a mystery, but as a problem to be solved. They brought something the city had never faced before: gunpowder. For centuries, the walls had been the ultimate answer to siege warfare. Now massive cannons were hauled into position, machines designed to shatter stone rather than test endurance. Each thunderous impact echoed across the Bosporus, announcing that the age of walls was ending. Inside the city, the sound carried more than fear. It carried history. The defenders were few. Soldiers stood beside civilians. Scholars and monks labored alongside craftsmen to repair breaches. Every able hand became part of the defense. The city no longer relied on empire, it relied on community. Faith deepened. Churches filled daily. Processions wound through streets scarred by age and neglect. Prayers rose not for victory alone, but for meaning. The people understood they were witnessing the closing of a story that had begun more than 1,000 years before. This was not merely a siege. It was a reckoning. Outside the walls, the besiegers tightened their grip. Supplies dwindled within. The sea, once Constantinople's lifeline, was contested. Hope narrowed to endurance, then to days, then to moments. Yet surrender was never truly considered. To surrender the city was to surrender memory itself. The empire had survived too long to yield quietly. If Byzantium were to end, it would end as it had lived, defiant, disciplined, and aware of what it represented. The city that had carried Rome through the fall of the ancient world now stood at the edge of the modern one. Its fall, if it came, would not be an accident of history. It would be a turning point. And as the cannons roared and the walls trembled, Constantinople prepared to make its final stand, not for conquest, not for dominion, but for the dignity of survival carried to its limit. The siege unfolded not as a single moment of terror, but as a relentless erosion of certainty. Day after day, the cannons spoke. Their thunder rolled across the land walls, shaking towers that had stood since antiquity. Each impact sent showers of stone into the air, dust clouding the battlements where defenders clung to positions passed down through generations. The walls still held, but they were no longer invulnerable. Cracks widened. Repairs grew desperate. The ancient confidence that stone could outlast any enemy began to fail. Inside Constantinople, time contracted. Life narrowed to routines of survival, repairing breaches by night, manning walls by day, praying whenever silence allowed. Food supplies dwindled. Rations were measured carefully, stretched thin across soldiers and civilians alike. Hunger became a constant presence, dull at first, then sharp, then impossible to ignore. Yet morale did not collapse. Something stronger than fear bound the defenders together. Awareness. They knew they were not simply defending a city. They were defending a lineage, a continuous thread stretching back to Rome, through emperors and councils, through plague and fire, through betrayals and rebirths. Every stone replaced in the wall felt like an act of remembrance. The emperor moved among them. He did not hide behind ceremony or distance. He walked the ramparts, spoke to soldiers, prayed beside citizens. His presence mattered, not because it promised victory, but because it affirmed shared fate. There would be no escape purchased with another's sacrifice. If the city fell, it would fall with its ruler at its head. Outside the walls, the besiegers adapted. They studied the defenses with methodical patience. Where assaults failed, they paused. Where cannons weakened stone, they concentrated fire. They controlled the sea with determination, severing the city's remaining lifelines. Every move reflected a new understanding of warfare, one shaped by technology, organization, and relentless pressure, rather than endurance alone. The defenders responded with ingenuity. Barriers were reinforced with earth and timber. Counterattacks disrupted siege works. Fire ships were launched in desperate attempts to reclaim control of the waters. Each small success lifted spirits briefly, only to remind everyone how narrow the margin had become. As days turned into weeks, exhaustion set in. Sleep came in fragments. Wounds festered. The constant noise of bombardment eroded nerves as surely as stone. Even prayer grew weary, not from doubt, but from repetition under strain. The city's defenders were not losing faith. They were spending it. Within the churches, candles burned continuously. The liturgy took on a new intensity, stripped of triumph and ornament. Words of endurance, sacrifice, and hope beyond death carried new weight. Byzantium had always believed history unfolded under divine judgment. Now that belief offered solace where strategy could not. The siege was no longer about whether the city could be saved. It was about how it would be remembered. As breaches widened, defenders rushed to fill them, sometimes with stone, sometimes with their own bodies. Civilians joined soldiers on the walls. Old men carried supplies. Women tended the wounded. Children watched silently, absorbing a lesson no generation should inherit. The city had become a single organism under attack. Each day the question returned, how much longer? The answer grew shorter with every dawn. The cannons did not tire. Supplies did not replenish. Reinforcements did not arrive. The empire that had once ruled continents now measured survival in hours. Yet even now, there was no panic. The city did not dissolve into chaos. Order held. Commands were obeyed. Repairs continued. Defense persisted not because victory was expected, but because surrender was unthinkable. This was Byzantium's final strength. Not walls, not armies, but discipline born of memory. The defenders understood that whatever happened next would echo far beyond these walls. The fall of Constantinople would not be another conquest among many. It would signal the end of an age, the closing of a civilization that had carried the ancient world across 1,000 years of change. And so, as the final preparations were made and the breaches grew too wide to conceal, the city waited, not in hope of rescue, but in readiness for the end. The final assault came before dawn. In the hours when the city had always slept beneath God's protection, the ground shook with movement. Outside the walls, the besieging army assembled in disciplined waves, light troops first, then heavier formations, then elite, waiting for the moment when resistance would finally break. The cannons had done their work. The walls, once eternal, were wounded beyond repair. Inside Constantinople, the defenders prepared without illusion. There were no speeches promising salvation, no last-minute hopes of relief. The city understood what was coming. Soldiers took their positions in silence. Civilians retreated to churches or stood beside the walls, refusing to hide from history. Candles burned in every sanctuary, their light flickering against mosaics that had watched over generations. The final liturgy was held while darkness still covered the city. Prayers rose not for victory, but for mercy, for souls, for memory, for meaning beyond the coming violence. The words were ancient, spoken countless times before, but never with such finality. The empire placed itself in God's hands, not as a conqueror seeking favor, but as a witness accepting judgment. When the attack began, it came with overwhelming force. Assaults struck the weakened sections of the walls again and again. Defenders fought hand to hand amid rubble and smoke. Arrows fell, steel clashed. The narrow passages of the defenses became killing grounds, where exhaustion erased fear and instinct replaced strategy. Still, the city held, briefly. Then a breach opened that could not be closed. The moment was not dramatic in the way legends later imagined. There was no single shout, no instant collapse. There was simply a point where resistance thinned, where too few defenders stood against too many attackers. Once that line broke, the rest followed with grim inevitability. Enemy forces poured into the city. Street fighting erupted, chaotic and brutal. The defenders fell back toward the heart of Constantinople, making their final stand amid familiar streets and sacred spaces. Some fought until they could no longer stand. Others shielded civilians, buying moments rather than victories. At the center of it all stood the emperor. He did not flee. He did not negotiate. He cast aside imperial insignia and joined the defense as a soldier among soldiers. His death, unmarked, uncelebrated, became the final act of an empire that had always defined itself by duty rather than spectacle. By mid-morning, the city was lost. The banners of a new age rose above the walls. The ancient capital fell silent beneath unfamiliar command. What had been the axis of the Roman world became something else, repurposed, redefined, absorbed into a future it would not control. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Homes were broken open. Treasures gathered over centuries were scattered in hours. Churches were stripped of relics and icons that had survived Iconoclasm, Crusade, and time itself. Knowledge stored in libraries vanished into flame, neglect, or foreign hands. But destruction was not total. As always, Byzantium endured in fragments. Some buildings survived. Some manuscripts were saved. Some traditions passed quietly into the new order. The conquerors did not erase the city. They transformed it. Constantinople did not die. It changed masters, languages, rhythms, the Roman world ended not in emptiness, but in transition. For the people who lived through it, the meaning was unmistakable. 1,000-year continuity had ended. The empire that had carried Rome's law, Greece's thought, and Christianity's early form across the collapse of antiquity was gone, not defeated by barbarians at the gates, but overtaken by time, technology, and the slow narrowing of possibility. And yet its legacy did not fall with its walls. Byzantine scholars who had fled earlier carried knowledge westward, fueling new intellectual awakenings. Orthodox faith endured across Eastern Europe and beyond, shaping cultures for centuries. Roman law, preserved and refined in Byzantium, continued to govern societies that had never known an emperor. The empire died, but its work survived. In this final moment, Byzantium fulfilled its unwritten role. It was not destined to rule forever. It was destined to endure long enough to preserve the ancient world when it would have vanished, long enough to shape faith, law, and culture beyond its borders, long enough to bridge eras that would otherwise have collapsed into silence. As the sun rose over the fallen city, a new world began. And the old one, Rome reborn, refined, and sustained for more than a millennium, passed into history not as a failure, but as one of humanity's greatest acts of continuity. Chapter 12. Legacy Beyond Empire. When Constantinople fell, the Byzantine Empire did not simply end, it dispersed. There was no single moment when its influence vanished, no clear line separating empire from aftermath. Instead, Byzantium dissolved into the world it had shaped for over 1,000 years, leaving behind institutions, ideas, and identities that would outlive its banners by centuries. Empires usually leave ruins. Byzantium left foundations. In the immediate years after the fall, observers across Europe and the Near East struggled to comprehend what had been lost. To many in the West, Constantinople had been distant, exotic, wealthy, enigmatic. Only in its absence did its role become clear. The city had been a barrier as much as a beacon, absorbing pressure from the East, stabilizing trade, and preserving continuity in a world defined by rupture. With its fall, a vacuum opened. Roots shifted. Power recalibrated. Fear spread westward as the realization settled that the ancient bulwark was gone. Yet even as anxiety grew, something else moved quietly in the opposite direction. Byzantine knowledge long accumulated began to circulate more freely than ever before. This was no accident. For generations before the end, Byzantine scholars had traveled, taught, copied, and preserved texts that the rest of Europe had forgotten. Philosophy, medicine, mathematics, history, works inherited from Greece and Rome, had survived not because they were revered relics, but because Byzantium had used them. Law students studied ancient jurists. Administrators learned rhetoric. The past remained functional. Now, with the empire gone, that knowledge escaped its final walls. Manuscripts reached Italy, the Balkans, and beyond. Scholars fluent in Greek introduced Western thinkers to texts long inaccessible in their original form. Ideas that had lived quietly in Constantinople's libraries re-entered the wider world, reshaping how Europeans understood philosophy, science, and human potential. This transfer would ignite transformation. What later generations called rebirth did not emerge from nothing. It emerged from inheritance. Byzantium had served as a reservoir, holding the ancient world intact until conditions elsewhere could receive it. The empire's fall accelerated this transmission, turning preservation into diffusion. Faith, too, endured beyond empire. Orthodox Christianity did not depend on Constantinople's political survival. Its liturgy, theology, and traditions had already taken root across Eastern Europe, the Balkans, and the Slavic world. The empire had shaped these regions not merely through rule, but through conversion, education, and cultural exchange. In these lands, Byzantium lived on, not as empire but as spiritual ancestry. Churches continued to follow Byzantine ritual. Icons preserved its aesthetic language. Theology reflected its debates and resolutions. Even where political authority faded, religious continuity remained unbroken. Law proved even more enduring. Roman legal tradition, refined and systematized in Byzantium, became the backbone of governance far beyond its former borders. Long after emperors disappeared, their laws guided courts, contracts, and concepts of justice. The idea that law could be rational, written, and universal was one of Byzantium's quiet gifts to history. This was legacy without spectacle. No triumphal return. No restoration of banners. Only persistence. The empire that had once defined itself through survival now achieved a different form of endurance, one beyond territory or power. It existed in minds, institutions, and beliefs rather than borders. Yet memory is selective. Over time, Byzantium's name itself faded in the West, replaced by misconceptions and caricature. Its complexity was simplified, its achievements obscured. The empire that had once seen itself as Rome was rebranded, misunderstood, and often dismissed. But history is patient. As centuries passed, scholars returned to Byzantine sources, uncovering the depth of what had been preserved and transmitted. Slowly, the empire re-emerged, not as a footnote, but as a central bridge between worlds. Byzantium had not been a pause between antiquity and modernity. It had been the passage. And as the world moved forward, it carried more of Byzantium within it than it ever realized. As the centuries passed, Byzantium's presence became most visible not in what it ruled, but in what it shaped. Long after the empire's political authority vanished, its influence continued to structure the lives of societies that had never seen Constantinople's walls or heard its ceremonies. This was power transformed. In Eastern Europe, Byzantium's imprint was unmistakable. Through diplomacy, marriage, and above all faith, the empire had woven itself into the identities of emerging states. Conversion to Orthodox Christianity carried more than belief. It carried language, law, art, and worldview. Liturgical rhythms structured time. Icons shaped how the divine was imagined. Theology shaped how authority was understood. These societies did not see Byzantium as foreign. They saw it as origin. Rulers adopted imperial titles modeled on Byzantine precedent. Courts mirrored Constantinopolitan ceremony. Capitals were planned to echo the sacred geometry of the old empire. Even when political independence was asserted, cultural lineage was not rejected. Byzantium became the standard by which legitimacy was measured. Nowhere was this more profound than in the lands to the north. There, the idea of a Christian empire, sanctified, orderly, and divinely guided, took deep root. With Constantinople gone, some began to see themselves as inheritors of its mission. This was not imitation alone. It was succession imagined through belief and memory. Byzantium's fall did not end imperial aspiration. It displaced it. In the West, Byzantium's influence worked differently. There, its legacy arrived not through direct succession, but through recovery. Greek learning, long preserved and commented upon in Byzantine schools, re-entered Western intellectual life. Philosophers encountered Aristotle in full, not fragment. Physicians studied medical texts refined over centuries. Historians rediscovered methods of analysis shaped in Constantinople's archives. The West did not receive Byzantium's empire. It received its mind. This transmission reshaped education, science, and political thought. Concepts of law, citizenship, and governance carried Byzantine fingerprints even when they were unacknowledged. Roman law, filtered through Byzantine preservation, became the foundation of modern legal systems. The idea that authority should be codified, systematic, and rational owed more to Byzantium than to medieval Europe's own traditions. Art carried the influence further still. Byzantine aesthetics, symbolic, hierarchical, transcendent, spread across regions and centuries. Churches echoed its forms. Icons traveled and were copied. Even when styles evolved, the underlying logic remained. Art as theology, image as meaning, beauty as order. This was not accidental. Byzantium had always believed culture was governance by other means. Art, ritual, and education shaped loyalty as surely as armies. That insight survived the empire's fall. Its methods outlived its power. Yet this influence was not always welcomed. In Western memory, Byzantium often became a foil, a symbol of excess, rigidity, or decline. Its complexity was flattened, its achievements reframed as obstacles rather than bridges. The empire that had preserved antiquity was accused of stifling it. This misunderstanding endured for centuries. Only slowly did historians begin to reassess Byzantium's role, not as a stagnant remnant, but as an adaptive, innovative civilization. Research revealed an empire that had governed effectively for a millennium, navigated crises with sophistication, and preserved knowledge under conditions that would have destroyed less disciplined states. The myth of decline gave way to recognition of endurance. And endurance, in the long view of history, is rare. Most empires burn brightly and vanish. Byzantium endured quietly, persistently, and deliberately. It survived not through conquest alone, but through administration, diplomacy, and belief. It understood that power was not only what could be taken, but what could be maintained. This lesson echoed long after its fall. Modern states inherited Byzantine approaches to bureaucracy, diplomacy, and legal continuity. The idea that institutions matter more than individuals, that systems outlast rulers, was one Byzantium practiced for centuries. Its failures were real, its contradictions undeniable. But its survival was not accidental. Byzantium shaped medieval world not by dominating it, but by stabilizing it long enough for others to emerge. It absorbed shocks that would have rippled outward. It preserved continuity when collapse was the norm. It carried the ancient world across a chasm of instability and delivered it, intact enough, to the future. This was its quiet triumph. And as the echoes of empire faded, Byzantium remained present, not as a shadow of Rome, but as a civilization whose influence outlived its existence. In the end, Byzantium achieved what few empires ever have. It outlived its own power. Long after its armies disbanded and its emperors disappeared into history, the civilization Byzantium forged continued to operate quietly within the structures of the world that replaced it. This was not survival through domination, but survival through diffusion. The empire did not conquer the future, it permeated it. Byzantium's greatest achievement was not that it endured for over 1,000 years. It was that it made those years matter. When the ancient world collapsed under the weight of invasion, fragmentation, and economic breakdown, Byzantium did not attempt to recreate the past unchanged. It selected, it preserved, it adapted. Roman law was refined rather than repeated. Greek philosophy was studied rather than worshipped. Christianity was organized, debated, and institutionalized rather than left to fracture endlessly. This deliberate continuity created stability in an age defined by instability. Where other societies rebuilt from ruin again and again, Byzantium maintained a thread of governance that never fully snapped. Bureaucracy functioned when charisma failed. Law persisted when force faltered. Records were kept. Titles meant something. Institutions remembered what individuals could not. This was Byzantium's genius. It understood that civilization is not spectacle. It is memory made operational. That understanding shaped everything it touched. Diplomatic language across medieval courts bore Byzantine influence. The idea that states should negotiate before fighting, that ritual could substitute for war, that hierarchy could prevent chaos, these were lessons learned from Constantinople's long survival. Even its failures taught history something vital. Byzantium showed that endurance requires compromise, and that compromise carries cost. It demonstrated how rigid identity can preserve cohesion while limiting flexibility. It revealed the dangers of isolation, pride, and delayed reform. Its decline was not sudden, nor inevitable, but it was instructive. Empires rarely fall from one mistake. They fall from accumulated ones. And yet, even in decline, Byzantium remained productive. Its final centuries were not barren. They were contemplative. Scholars reflected rather than expanded. Art turned inward, emphasizing transcendence over grandeur. Theology grappled openly with suffering, impermanence, and hope beyond history. In this way, Byzantium prepared not for continuation, but for legacy. When the empire finally vanished as a political entity, it left behind a world already shaped by its presence. Europe inherited Roman law filtered through Byzantine precision. Eastern Christianity inherited liturgy, theology, and sacred art, shaped by centuries of debate and refinement. Emerging states inherited models of administration, diplomacy, and imperial identity, even when they rejected Byzantine authority itself. This is the paradox of Byzantium. It was often misunderstood, sometimes resented, frequently underestimated, yet almost always essential. It stood between worlds, absorbing pressure from all directions, rarely thanked for the time it brought others to develop. History often celebrates beginnings and endings. Byzantium lived in between. It was the civilization of continuity, the bridge between antiquity and modernity, between classical thought and medieval order, between Rome's collapse and Europe's re-emergence. Without Byzantium, the ancient world would not have ended more gently. It would have ended more completely. And so the empire's final legacy is not found in maps or monuments alone. It is found in legal systems that value continuity, in churches that preserve ritual across centuries, in texts that survived because someone believed they were worth copying again, in the very idea that civilization can endure without conquering. Byzantium teaches that power is not only the ability to expand, but the discipline to persist. That survival can be an achievement equal to triumph. The memory, carefully preserved, can shape futures long after armies fall silent. The empire did not live forever, but it lived long enough to carry the ancient world through darkness, long enough to shape faith, law, and culture across continents, long enough to prove that history does not belong only to those who conquer, but also to those who endure. And in that endurance, Byzantium secured what no empire ever truly seeks, yet few ever achieve: a place not just in history, but in the foundations of the world that followed.